Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy slow history, relaxing explanations, and calming facts, then go ahead and subscribe, like the video, and let us know in the comments. What time are you watching this? Are you lying in bed right now? Or maybe just relaxing after a long day? Also tell us, where are you watching from? It's always amazing to see this quiet, sleepy community all over the world. Tonight, we're exploring a question that's oddly fascinating. How did people sleep in the Middle Ages? From the filth of the common folk to the quiet luxuries of the castle bedchamber, medieval sleep wasn't just rest. It was a struggle, a ritual, a moment of danger, discomfort, and cold. In this video, we'll tell you how peasants laid on straw while rats chewed their food beside them, how families slept fully clothed in one bed, and how even kings were afraid of drafts, disease, and betrayal in the night. We'll explore the details of sleeping arrangements, the sounds, the smells, the fears, the rare comforts, and the strange customs of a world long gone, all explained in the slowest, most peaceful voice we can manage, so you can drift off gently. This is boring history for sleep, and tonight we'll begin where most people in the Middle Ages ended their long days, flat on their backs, under thin blankets with no privacy, no pillows, and no real peace. In the Middle Ages, sleep was something you earned. After sunrise to sunset labor, after walking long distances, pulling weeds, feeding animals, repairing tools, fetching water, or baking on stone hearths, the body collapsed wherever it was allowed to. For most of the population, nearly 90% of people, that meant sleeping inside a single-room home made of wood and mud, known as a wattle and daub hut. These homes had no insulation, no chimney, no real mattress, and no beds in the modern sense. A peasant home was often shared by 5 to 8 people, including parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents. There was one sleeping space, usually a pile of straw or hay, sometimes covered by a sheet of linen or an old wool blanket, and laid directly on the packed earth floor. If the family was lucky, there might be a wooden frame, raised slightly to avoid dampness, but in most poor households, sleep happened on the ground. The straw would become dirty, flattened, infested with fleas, lice, and sometimes even rodents. The family slept close together, not for affection, but for warmth. Bodies were the only heating system. Clothes were not removed before bed. In fact, most people slept in the same tunic or gown they had worked in that day. Undergarments were rarely washed, and bedding even less. People might go months without changing linens, simply shaking out the straw when it became too filthy. The smell inside such homes was thick, a mix of sweat, damp earth, smoke, animals, and unwashed feet. But to those who lived in it, it was normal. The night itself wasn't quiet. There were always noises, scratching of mice and rats, the occasional low groan of someone's stomach, coughing, snoring, the creak of the door if wind blew through, the distant howling of wolves or barking of dogs outside. Firelight, if there was any, came from a candle made of tallow, rendered animal fat, which gave off a foul smell and thick smoke. It was often extinguished quickly to save the candle and avoid choking. Darkness then settled over everything, complete and inescapable. There were no lamps, no street lights, no glowing clocks. The only source of light sometimes was the moon through a crack in the wood. Families spoke little before bed. The day had taken their energy. Children sometimes whispered or giggled or complained about the cold. Older family members might mumble a prayer, but most simply curled inward, wrapped in whatever they had, a wool cloak, a spare tunic, and tried to stay asleep until morning. Sleep, however, didn't come all at once. People in the Middle Ages often followed a 2-part sleep pattern. After dusk, they would sleep for several hours, then wake around midnight. This period of wakefulness, called the watch, could last an hour or more. During this time, people might tend the fire, pray, check on animals, or even speak quietly with their spouse. Afterward, they would return to bed for the second sleep, lasting until dawn. For the wealthy, sleep was different, but not always better. Inside a stone manor or castle, the lord and lady had separate chambers from their servants and guards. A bed might be raised on a wooden frame, with a mattress stuffed with feathers or wool. There could be thick blankets, real pillows, and even curtains to trap heat and block out drafts. These four-poster beds were not just furniture, they were status symbols, often carved with the family's crest or religious icons. Servants might sleep on pallets near the wall, ready to be summoned at night. Still, despite their wealth, even the rich feared the night. Assassination was common in power struggles, and many nobles slept with weapons nearby. Drafts from stone walls made chambers freezing. Without fireplaces, even castle rooms became cold, damp, and unpleasant. Chamber pots were used to relieve oneself at night, stored under the bed, and often emptied by servants in the morning, usually by throwing the contents into the moat or alleyway. The smell of chamber pots, stale food, perfume, and burning oil filled the rooms. Privacy was rare, even for kings. Curtains provided some, but servants were always nearby. Meanwhile, monks in monasteries had a strict schedule for sleep. Most monasteries followed a rule that required waking during the night to attend prayer services. Monks might sleep in dormitories, fully clothed, on wooden planks or straw mats, and be woken by the ringing of a bell. These nighttime prayers were part of their spiritual discipline. They often only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, broken into shifts. Their sleep was cold, disciplined, and deliberately uncomfortable, a form of humility. Back in the villages, sleep was also interrupted by fear. Fire was a constant danger. A single stray coal from the hearth could light a thatched roof. Parents would sleep nearest the hearth to monitor it, often placing stones around the fire to trap heat. But accidents happened. Entire homes, and sometimes villages, burned in the night. Thieves also came under cover of darkness. Most villagers had little to steal, but that didn't stop desperate or cruel men. Dogs, if a family had one, would sleep near the door and bark at any sound. A loud bark in the middle of the night would wake the entire household. Some villagers kept weapons near their bedding, a knife, a club, a sharpened stick. Even children knew how to defend themselves if necessary. For women, sleep could be especially uncomfortable. Childbirth was common, painful, and dangerous. Pregnant women often shared straw with their children and husbands, even in late stages. There were no midwives in many villages, and labor often happened at night in silence under the dim light of a candle with only other women present. After giving birth, a woman would return to her chores within days, sleeping beside her newborn on the same thin straw, hoping for no infection. Babies were swaddled tightly, but many died in the night. From cold, malnutrition, or suffocation, death was normal and grief was silent. Life went on dot, and yet not all was misery. In the brief moments before falling asleep, villagers sometimes sang, mothers hummed lullabies, couples whispered stories. Elders told tales of saints and spirits, trying to explain the strange dreams that came in the night. Sleep was feared, but also welcomed. It was the only escape from the day's hardship. And for a few hours, no matter how filthy, no matter how sore or afraid, the body could rest. When the rooster crowed and the fire was reignited, the struggle began again. But until then, there was sleep. We can begin to sink more deeply into the forgotten, uncomfortable, and highly repetitive reality of daily night routines across different parts of medieval society. Sleep wasn't just a matter of closing one's eyes, it was a physical negotiation. With the cold, the filth, and the bodies lying around you. For the average medieval peasant, bedtime was not an event, but a slow, automatic transition after dusk. Once the evening meal had been consumed, usually something like thick barley porridge, a stale crust of bread, or a weak onion soup, families would finish whatever small chores could still be done in the fading light. This might include scraping pots, folding damp linen, or tending to the embers of a fire that had been used for both cooking and warming the home. Light was extremely limited. Most peasants could not afford candles on a regular basis. Tallow candles made from animal fat burned quickly and smelled unpleasant, and beeswax candles were a luxury reserved for the church or the wealthy. Therefore, once the sun went down, the home went dark. In the total blackness, peasants relied on instinct and memory to navigate their small, cramped spaces. Many slept beside livestock such as goats or chickens, which were brought inside at night to protect them from thieves or wild animals. This meant that a common home might be filled with not only the sounds of snoring family members, but also the clucking of chickens, the occasional bleating of a sheep, or the scratching of rats along the wooden beams. Rats were extremely common. They lived in the straw beds, gnawed at stored food, and often crawled across sleeping bodies. Peasants learned to ignore them, to live with them, as they did with fleas and lice, which were constant companions. Hygiene was minimal, and bathing was rare. Most people believed that bathing too often weakened the body. Water was often unclean, and heating it required fuel that was too valuable to waste. As a result, sleep took place in a state of general physical discomfort, itchy skin, matted hair, aching muscles, open blisters, and untreated infections were part of normal life. For children, sleep was sometimes a bit lighter, both literally and figuratively. They often shared sleeping space with their siblings, if not their parents. Infants slept beside their mothers, swaddled tightly, but the risk of being rolled over or suffocated was very real. Some families placed wooden boards or cloth partitions between the baby and the adults, but many did not. Toddlers would often fall asleep in the same clothes they wore all day, covered only by a shared blanket, if there was one. Most nights were cold. Central heating did not exist, and fireplaces, if a home had one at all, were inefficient and required constant tending. Blankets were usually homemade, thick wool, coarse and itchy, sometimes patched with older garments or rags. Some families used animal hides, which still carried the scent of the barn. There were no bed sheets, no clean linens, no seasonal bedding changes. If it was particularly cold, the family simply slept closer together, sometimes in shifts if the sleeping space was too small. Ventilation in these huts was poor. With many bodies in a small space, the air quickly became stale, and in winter, windows, if they existed, were kept closed. That meant smoke from the fire, breath from humans and animals, and general body odors would hang thick in the air. Some people hung herbs from the rafters, rosemary, sage, or lavender, not for beauty, but in a desperate attempt to mask the ever-present stink. These herbs were also thought to protect against illness, which was believed to travel through foul air. Disease was always a concern. Fevers, infections, and plagues came with no warning. There was no medicine to speak of, no doctors in the villages. If someone developed a cough, a rash, or a strange ache, there was little to be done beyond prayer and help. And so people feared the night. Many believed that demons and spirits came at night. The church taught that the devil was most active in darkness, and that dreams could be corrupted by evil. Some peasants whispered that nightmares were sent by angry ancestors or forest spirits. Children were told stories of ghosts or witches who came in the dark to punish the wicked or steal the soul of a sleeping baby. This may sound like folklore, but to them it was a real part of life. People hung crosses above their sleeping places or placed iron objects near the bed to ward off evil. Religious faith was deeply woven into sleeping routines. Most said prayers before lying down. "Now I lay me down to sleep" was more than a saying. It was a genuine plea to survive the night. People died in their sleep from illness, from cold, or sometimes without any explanation. Among the richer classes, sleep had its own rules. Nobles had personal chambers with large wooden beds, stuffed mattresses, heavy drapes, and even heating stones, flat pieces of iron heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth to warm the bed. Yet even in castles, the cold crept in through the stone. Despite luxury, comfort was still relative. Noble women often slept in layers of clothing, and men sometimes wore nightcaps. Servants came in to prepare the bed, pull the drapes, or light a fire before bedtime, but privacy was rare. Lords and ladies often shared their rooms with attendants or bodyguards. Castles were drafty and echoed with strange sounds at night, creaking wood, wind howling through corridors, and sometimes the noises of drunken guests, political rivals, or scheming family members. Wealthy individuals also feared poisoning or assassination, especially if they were involved in court politics. Some nobles slept with daggers under their pillows. Others locked their chambers or posted guards at their doors. Sleep, even in comfort, came with its own form of anxiety. In religious institutions, monks and nuns followed strict routines. Monks in Benedictine monasteries, for example, rose several times during the night to pray. They did not consider sleep a luxury, but a distraction from spiritual duty. Monks slept in long halls, side by side, fully clothed, sometimes with only a thin blanket or straw mat. There was no talking, no whispering, no privacy. The bell would ring at midnight or 2 a.m., calling them to prayer, known as vigils or matins. Afterward, they returned to their cold beds for a few more hours of rest before rising again before dawn. Their lives were regimented, ascetic, and based on discipline. Sleep was just another form of spiritual training to endure cold, discomfort, and fatigue without complaint. In towns and cities, conditions varied. Urban poor often lived in shared buildings with multiple families. Sleeping in stairwells, attics, or even stables was not unusual. There were no regulations, no safety codes. Fires were a constant threat. Entire neighborhoods could burn overnight. Wooden buildings stood close together, and candles used carelessly cost massive. Places. Wealthy merchants in towns might have feather beds, imported sheets, and paid servants to clean and prepare their sleeping quarters. But even they could not avoid rats, noise, or disease. Towns were filled with noise even at night. Drunkards, horses, beggars, church bells, and the occasional cries of pain, celebration, or violence. Sleep was always vulnerable, and so, across all layers of medieval society, sleep meant something different than it does today. It was not luxurious, peaceful, or private. It was shared, physical, exposed. It was an act of survival. People slept with others, not by choice, but by necessity. They did not control their environment. The air they breathed was cold or smoky. The floor beneath them was hard or alive with insects. The person beside them might be coughing, shivering, or dying. Children cried at night. Adults groaned in their sleep. Some people talked in dreams. Others woke with nightmares and clutched their holy relics. And yet, every morning, the same routine began. The fire was stirred. The door was unbolted, and the world, harsh as it was, welcomed them back into another day of labor. Sleep had not refreshed them, only numbed them enough to begin again. By the time night settled across medieval villages and the fires were reduced to faint orange glows in hearths built from rough stone, the act of preparing for sleep began its long and repetitive rhythm. There was no bedtime routine as we might think of it today. There were no toothbrushes, no nightgowns specifically made for comfort, no slipping between fresh sheets or adjusting the thermostat. Instead, in most rural homes, people prepared for sleep simply by not doing anything further. No more gathering, no more baking, no more cleaning. They simply sat until they couldn't stay upright, then lay down where they were. Sometimes they stretched or rubbed sore joints, or adjusted their position on the flattened straw where they'd slept the night before. If someone happened to feel slightly cleaner, it was likely because they had walked through rain that afternoon, or briefly rinsed their hands in a stream. For peasants, hygiene was never truly separated from sleep because it didn't exist in any meaningful way. They didn't wash before bed or after waking. They didn't change into specific clothing for sleeping. Most had a single set of clothes, and so they lay down in what they wore, not because it was traditional, but because there was simply no alternative. Clothing was reused, patched, reworn, and never entirely clean. Sleeves frayed, hems darkened with dirt, and seams were often broken or uneven. Lice and fleas lived in the fabric and the bedding, and were considered an unpleasant but normal part of life. Occasionally, people would beat the straw bedding with sticks to remove some of the insects or shake out the dirt. But unless it was completely unlivable, they would simply sleep on top of it again. Families would also gather their sleeping bodies closely, either out of necessity due to space or for warmth. A mother might sleep with 2 children pressed against her, a father on the other side, and possibly a goat resting near the wall. If it was particularly cold, they might pull extra straw over themselves or use old cloaks. The layering of material was random, not structured like modern bedding. A fur, a smock, a torn tunic, or even a sack could become part of the nightly layering. For most medieval villagers, the fire had to be maintained even while sleeping. This meant that someone, usually an elder or whoever happened to wake first, would tend to the embers, adjust the logs, and ensure that warmth continued through the deepest part of the night. Many homes had only one room, and the hearth was central. There was no real division between cooking, working, and sleeping areas. Therefore, sleep was not entirely separate from waking life. The sights, smells, and tools of daily survival remained around them as they slept. Pots hung above the ashes. A wooden bowl might rest near someone's head. Drying herbs or stored onions might dangle above them from wooden beams. Animals often wandered through the home, stepping on straw, making sounds, or even disturbing. Sleepers in search of warmth. Most people did not sleep deeply. They rested in a light, broken way, waking often to adjust position, shift aching limbs, or react to noises. There were few uninterrupted nights. Children cried or fussed. Neighbors' dogs barked. Wind rattled loose planks. People were used to waking for no reason. In many parts of Europe, the idea of segmented sleep, sleeping in 2 parts, broken by a period of quiet activity or prayer, was common. During that middle night wakefulness, people sometimes whispered together or sat in silence. They did not expect 8 continuous hours of rest. It was a slow, staggered sleep molded by necessity and nature. The total darkness helped. Without artificial light and with the quiet chill of night pressing down, people became still. Those in colder regions faced particular hardship. In Northern Europe during winter, nights were long and brutally cold. People slept in everything they had: wool, fur, linen. They shared beds not just with family, but sometimes with traveling neighbors, strangers, or laborers. Privacy was almost non-existent. Even the act of turning over could wake others. Snoring, coughing, or movement was not considered rude, just part of the night. If someone had a nightmare and woke shouting, others would soothe them or turn away. A child wedding. The straw was not rare, and little was done except to move to a drier spot. The idea of personal space did not exist in the same way. People were born, lived, and slept inches from others their entire lives. Over time, beds for the wealthier classes developed into complex pieces of furniture, while peasants still slept on the floor. A noble's bed might be elevated, carved, and covered with heavy curtains. But even among the better-off farmers or tradesmen, you might find beds made of wooden planks or rope netting with straw-stuffed mattresses on top. These mattresses would be laid out at night and stored away during the day in some households, depending on the size of the home. In larger peasant houses or inns, there might be lofts or platforms where people slept above the main room. But even then, privacy was minimal. Often, those sleeping above could hear every word and sound below. Smells dominated the sleep environment. There was no escaping them. Smoke from the fire, which had no chimney to escape through, clung to clothes, walls, and hair. Body odor was constant and strong. Manure from nearby pens drifted in through open gaps in the wall. Chamber pots, rarely emptied at night, added to the atmosphere. If anyone in the home was sick, with a fever, open wound, or infection, the smell of pus or sickness was simply part of the environment. People learned not to comment on it. Instead, they adapted. Sleep occurred not because the space was restful, but because the body had no choice. People had little sense of time. They didn't go to bed at 10 p.m. or wake at 6 a.m. They followed the sun and seasons. In summer, they might sleep late after long days of labor. In winter, they might sleep early to conserve candlelight. Some households used simple candle clocks. A candle marked with hours, which would burn slowly through the night. Others relied on the rooster, the church bell, or simply instinct. Sleep was not scheduled, but flowed around daily work dot in wealthier homes. The bedtime process was more structured. A noblewoman might be undressed by a servant. Her hair would be combed. A fire would be lit in the fireplace. A chamber pot set. Nearby, heavy curtains drawn. In some cases, herbal sachets, dried lavender, thyme, or sage, were placed in the bed to improve the scent and supposedly aid sleep. Still, drafts were a problem. Stone walls retained cold, and windows were unglazed. Even kings complained of night chills. And despite their status, many nobles still suffered from lice and bedbugs. There was no escape from the natural world. Peasants, meanwhile, had no such rituals. The day faded, and they lay down. The morning returned, and they stood up. That was all. A mother might cradle a child to sleep, or a husband might grunt before turning his back. But there were no formal prayers, no special garments, no structured transitions. The only rhythm was that of the seasons, longer sleep in winter, shorter in summer, and always dictated by how hard the body had worked that day. Sleep was functional. Nothing more dot, and so night after night, year after year, generations of men, women, and children closed their eyes in rooms barely protected from the world outside. With fleas biting, rats scratching, smoke hanging in the rafters, and cold seeping through cracks in the wall, they did what humans have always done. They endured, they drifted off, and they woke to begin again. As we move deeper into the forgotten details of medieval nightly life, the repetition and plainness of it becomes more noticeable and even more important to understand. Because when we picture the past, especially the Middle Ages, we often imagine events, battles, feasts, plagues, pilgrimages. But for most people, most of the time, life was an ongoing cycle of dull routine, and that included sleep. In fact, the sleep of medieval people, especially peasants and lower classes, was not an isolated event. but an ongoing experience shaped by constant environmental repetition, limited choice, and slow changing habits, passed down across generations. For example, one of the unnoticed facts about medieval sleeping habits is the influence of the agricultural calendar on rest cycles. In harvest months, such as August and September, people worked well past dusk and slept fewer hours due to the demands of the season. In contrast, during midwinter, when work slowed due to snow or frozen ground, people slept longer, sometimes going to bed shortly after sunset and not rising until well after dawn. The structure of night depended entirely on natural light and the activities surrounding it. In most rural homes, the process of preparing for sleep remained deeply connected to food. After the final meal, often identical to the midday meal, and made from whatever had been preserved, families would store leftovers if possible. Grains were set in cloth bags, small chunks of cheese wrapped in waxed linen, dried beans stored on shelves. Then fire embers were gathered or covered to preserve them. Often, a clay pot filled with warm ashes was placed near the hearth to hold a hot coal through the night. The purpose of keeping a coal alive was not luxury, it was necessity. Reigniting fire in the morning without flint or tinder could take over an hour. A glowing ember made that task easier, and so even sleep had a fire-related preparation. If the fire went cold, mornings became harder. And if a stray spark touched straw or dry wood, the entire home could burn before anyone had time to react. Therefore, some families took turns waking in the night to check the hearth. This role usually fell to elders or to whichever adult woke up during first sleep. Speaking of first sleep, the idea of segmented sleeping, now largely forgotten, was standard in many parts of medieval Europe. People went to bed shortly after darkness fell, slept for roughly 4 hours, then woke. This waking period, sometimes called the watch, was used in various ways. Some people prayed quietly. Others tended to small tasks, mending, clothing by firelight, whispering stories, or even stepping outside to relieve themselves or check the animals. This was a quiet, still time. The night was not dead. It was active in a slow way. Then, after an hour or two, people returned to bed and entered second sleep, which lasted until morning light. This pattern was described in diaries, letters, and monastic writings. It was not unusual. In fact, it was a norm. Only after industrialization and artificial lighting did continuous 8-hour sleep become standard. In the Middle Ages, broken sleep was part of a natural rhythm. As the homes themselves remained basic mud walls, thatched roofs, minimal furnishings, so too did the sleeping environments. There were no closets, no bedrooms in the modern sense. A family of 6 might sleep in the same room where meals were eaten and tools were stored. Sometimes there was a raised wooden platform for sleeping, but more often people simply laid down on straw piled in a corner. That straw would be used for weeks, sometimes months, flattened and slowly decomposing beneath the pressure of human weight and moisture. Sweat, spilled water, animal droppings, and food crumbs made the straw beds increasingly unpleasant. Families shook out or replaced the bedding only when it became completely unusable. Beneath the straw, the floor was usually packed dirt, occasionally covered with rushes. These rushes were seldom cleaned and often contained fleas, mites, and other pests. Livestock such as chickens, goats, and dogs might wander through the room at night. The chicken might roost near the fire, while a goat lay beside the sleeping children. No space was wasted. The concept of a clean sleeping environment simply didn't exist in towns. Sleeping was sometimes noisier and more cramped. Families who lived above shops or workshops often shared beds between siblings or even with apprentices. The beds were narrow, with shared blankets and sometimes little more than a padded sack on wooden planks. The wealthy had more privacy, but even they rarely slept alone. Servants slept nearby, often in the same room. Some were assigned to sleep at the foot of the bed or just outside the chamber doors in case they were needed. Ladies in waiting and chambermaids, especially for high-ranking women, stayed close during the night. Men had squires or guards nearby. Large homes were cold, with no central heating, and stone walls sucked the warmth from the air. Even in luxury, comfort was limited. Another detail often overlooked is the lack of sleep aids. There were no alarms, no clocks, no music. People relied on the rising sun, the crowing of roosters, and the sound of bells from churches or monasteries. These bells marked time, matins, lauds, prime, and structured both day and night. In monastic settings, the bell would ring in the middle of the night, calling monks to prayers. They would rise from narrow cots in long communal dormitories, fully clothed, and walk silently into the chapel. After prayer, they returned to their beds for a second sleep. These routines were rigid and spiritual. Monks considered comfort a temptation. Their sleep was short, cold, and disciplined. In contrast, peasants might dream of warm sleep, literally. In the dead of winter, when wind crept through wall cracks and frost formed on windows, families huddled together. Older children were often used as warm buffers. A mother might sleep between her baby and a teenager. Dogs provided warmth too. Pigs were sometimes allowed indoors during extreme cold, not out of affection, but because they radiated heat. There are records of entire families lying beside animals for survival, and while this was unpleasant, it was practical. Night after night, the goal was not peace, but preservation. Sleep, in this context, became something less restful and more biological. People didn't chase comfort, they simply endured discomfort. They fell asleep because they were exhausted. They woke because it was morning. There were no soft mattresses, no blankets changed with the seasons, no sleep schedules or wellness routines. Just fatigue, darkness, and necessity. And so the cycle continued. Night after night, bodies settled into straw or wood, cloaks were wrapped, fire embers checked, and sounds of sleep, breathing, shifting, snoring, whispering, animal wrestling filled the air. Medieval sleep was not glamorous, nor peaceful, nor ideal, but it was constant and deeply human. Every class, from king to shepherd, shared in the act of surrendering to darkness, hoping for morning. It becomes even more evident that the experience of sleep during the Middle Ages was not a unique or isolated activity, but one that was deeply rooted in repetition, habit, limitation, and survival. With each passing evening, life did not dramatically shift. Rather, it quietly returned to the same needs: warmth, darkness, protection from cold air and biting insects, and enough stillness for the body to rest in preparation for the next day's identical labor. If you walked into any rural village in 12th century Europe, whether England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Scandinavian regions, you would find small wooden houses clustered together, each filled with the scent of smoke, old food, and unwashed bodies. And inside those houses, as night fell, every family began their sleep process in nearly the same fashion. The final light from the fire would be fed one last piece of wood, and families would begin to settle in. In homes with only a single room, the hearth was central, and bedding was arranged around it with practicality, not comfort. The elderly would often lie closest to the fire, as they were most vulnerable to the cold. Children would be tucked between parents. Any guests or workers who stayed over would take whatever floor space remained. Straw, cloth scraps, old animal skins, or even sacks of grain would be used to make lying on the ground somewhat less harsh. There were no individualized beds for most peasants, nor were there private spaces. Sleeping arrangements were not based on comfort, but on warmth and available space. That meant people slept pressed against one another with little personal distance. If someone moved or turned over, others felt it. If someone coughed or groaned in their sleep, everyone heard it. If a dog barked outside or a rat ran across the floor, it would interrupt the group's shallow slumber. This communal sleep was not considered abnormal. It was how life worked. There were no expectations of solitude, privacy, or uninterrupted rest. What mattered most was surviving the night and preserving the health of the family enough to work again tomorrow. Beds, in the sense of modern furniture, were rare in poor households. If anything was raised off the ground, it might be a wooden plank or a rope bed frame, often sagging with time. Rope beds had to be tightened regularly, otherwise they sagged into the middle. The phrase sleep tight is believed to come from this need to keep the ropes taut, but even that level of bedding was far beyond the means of most. The common villager slept directly on straw, refreshed maybe a few times a year. Mattresses, for those who had them, were usually stuffed with straw, hay, dried leaves, or wool scraps. They would be encased in coarse linen or rough cotton and rarely, if ever, washed. Bugs lived within. Mice nested in corners. The musty smell grew stronger over time, yet this was simply tolerated. People adapted to smells, noises, and discomfort. The term luxury didn't exist in most minds. They had no comparisons to suggest life could be more restful. Even wealthier peasants or tradesmen who could afford better sleeping materials had little more than a wooden bed frame with a worn-out mattress and a couple of rough wool blankets. Blankets were never decorative. They were tools, heavy, itchy, often filled with holes, sometimes shared among several family members. Wool was the most common material. In colder areas, furs or pelts from sheep, goats, or deer were used. These were not luxurious. They were smelly, stiff, and sometimes still had bits of hide clinging to them. Cleanliness was not prioritized. The idea of changing bedding regularly didn't exist. It was more likely that beds were abandoned and rebuilt seasonally than cleaned. Weekly, when lice or fleas became too overwhelming, some families might burn their straw bedding and start over. Others simply endured. In the case of nobility, beds were larger and higher off the ground, and were often fitted with bed curtains. These were not purely aesthetic. They helped block drafts from stone walls and provided a rare illusion of privacy. A nobleman and his wife might sleep in a curtained four-poster bed, surrounded by tapestries and thick fabrics to absorb some of the cold. But the room itself, with no insulation, no central heating, and no glass windows, still remained cold, especially during winter. A fireplace might burn in the corner, but it would be far from the bed. Servants brought heated stones wrapped in cloth to warm the sheets temporarily, but the warmth didn't last long, and servants themselves slept in nearby corners, in narrow cots, on hard benches, or on the floor, always close enough to be summoned, but never in comfort. In religious buildings, especially monasteries, sleep was even more regulated. Monks lived under strict orders, and the amount of time they were allowed to sleep was often minimized. Some orders permitted only 4 or 5 hours of rest, broken by nighttime prayers. Monks slept fully clothed in communal halls. Silence was enforced, no talking, no movement beyond what was necessary. Their beds, if they could be called that, were usually wooden platforms, straw mats, or simple planks. Blankets were provided, but were thin. Monastic life encouraged discomfort. The idea was to detach from physical pleasure and strengthen spiritual discipline. Sleep was functional, not enjoyable. Nighttime prayer bells would ring loudly in the dark, waking the entire dormitory. The monks would rise, still half asleep, and move in silent lines to the chapel. After prayers, they might return to their beds or begin early morning duties. Their sleep, like their lives, was strictly scheduled. In all social classes, fear surrounded sleep. Not always dramatic fear, but constant awareness of danger. Fire was one. With open flames burning in every home and roofs made of thatch or wood, a single spark could kill an entire family. Many homes had no chimneys, so smoke collected in the air. A sudden wind gust might send burning ash into dry straw. Some families placed stones around the fire to help contain it. Others slept near it, risking burns just to stay warm. Another threat was illness. There were no doctors for peasants. If a person developed a fever or breathing trouble during the night, the family could only pray. The night was long, and morning often came too late. Disease spread quickly in these tight spaces. If one child had a cough, all children had it the next week. If someone vomited in the night, it stained the bedding, and no one had the means to clean it properly. Bedding was used again regardless. Sickness was simply absorbed into the home, part of the routine. Death during sleep was not rare. The elderly, the very young, the weak, many slipped away silently. Others woke to find their bedmates cold. This too was normal. And still people slept because they had to. Not out of comfort, but from exhaustion. Laborers who worked from dawn until dusk had no trouble falling asleep. They had no choice. Their muscles ached, their eyes burned from smoke and sun, their skin itched from sweat and bites. They simply collapsed. No sleep aids, no entertainment, no distractions. Just quiet, dark, and exhaustion. In summer, the heat made sleep harder. Air was still, flies buzzed, and bodies sweated heavily. In winter, frost formed on the inside of walls. Breath turned to visible mist. Toes and fingers went numb. People slept in shifts, rotating positions, sometimes waking to walk around and regain warmth. Each night followed the same pattern. Home grew dim. A few murmured words were exchanged. A prayer might be whispered, then silence. Someone snored. A baby fussed. A log cracked in the fire. Then slowly, everyone drifted into the slow, scratchy, uneasy rest of the medieval night. As we continue our long, slow journey into the sleep life of the medieval world, it becomes increasingly clear that the act of resting at night was not an isolated event, but part of a greater rhythm, a rhythm shaped by the tools people had, the spaces they occupied, the weather outside their homes, the diseases they carried, and the exhausting repetition of daily survival. By the time darkness had fully fallen across the landscape, whether it was a valley in rural France, a northern English village, a narrow stone street in Bruges, or a small hamlet outside of Prague, the same patterns began again. The same motions, the same sights, the same cold creeping in around door frames, the same worn blankets, folded and unfolded without washing, used again. The same fire fading into warm orange embers, the same coughing child in the corner, the same restless shifting of bodies as people tried to find a warm spot on the straw. Sleep was not something people looked forward to in the way modern people do. It was something they slipped into almost unconsciously. Not as pleasure, but as a necessity, something mechanical, something that followed work in darkness the same way the sun follows the day. A medieval laborer would finish his evening meal, a coarse porridge made from ground barley or oats, perhaps with a few turnips or dried beans if the household was fortunate, and then, with the light already fading or gone, there was very little left to do but lie down, no books, no devices, no light, just the fire, the straw, and the sounds of others settling in. For women, sometimes additional chores stretched into the night, mending, feeding infants, preparing scraps for the next day's meal. But eventually, even that came to a stop, and everyone turned inward toward the night. toward the place on the floor or platform or bench where they would again attempt to rest. In most homes, people slept in their clothes. There were no special garments for sleep, no changing into pajamas. Clothes were worn until they were out. They were patched, repatched, then eventually used for bedding or rags. A single garment might serve for years. Sleep occurred in whatever people had worn through the day: stained tunics, work aprons, underlayers that had not seen washing. For weeks or months, and bedding, such as it was, consisted of anything that offered warmth: old cloaks, coarse wool blankets, matted animal skins, or the sleeves of coats wrapped around bare feet. People placed stones around the hearth to heat and then wrapped them in cloth to use as crude bed warmers. But the heat faded fast and cold was constant. In winter, water inside homes could freeze. In summer, insects buzzed in the darkness, attracted by the warmth of bodies. And yet, for the people of the Middle Ages, this was not something to complain about. It was just sleep. Houses were simple. Most peasants lived in single-room homes with thatched roofs and no insulation. The fire pit in the middle provided warmth, light, and smoke, which, in some ways, helped drive off certain insects. There were no beds with sheets. Instead, there were piles of straw or rushes spread across the dirt floor, sometimes raised. Slightly on wooden platforms, sometimes not. A family of 5 or 6 would sleep shoulder to shoulder. Privacy didn't exist. Parents, children, sometimes hired workers, and occasionally animals all occupied the same dark space. A piglet might be brought inside for warmth. Chickens slept on rafters overhead. Dogs curled near the feet of children. Every movement created a sound, and yet the sounds were not disruptive. They were simply part of the environment. A creaking floorboard, a cough, a snore, a shifting blanket, the sound of someone muttering in their sleep, all of it blended into the noise of night. Some families, if they could afford it, created makeshift dividers, hanging cloth between the sleeping area and the rest of the room. But even the separation was more symbolic than real. Anyone stirring would disturb everyone. In towns, the situation was different, but not always better. Urban homes were often multi-storied, narrow, crowded, and built closely together. Entire families sometimes shared a single room above a shop. Noise from neighbors, animals, drunken passersby, church bells, and early morning merchants filled the streets. There was no true quiet. And in the wealthier areas of towns or castles, while sleeping spaces became more elaborate, they still lacked most modern comforts. Even lords and ladies endured discomforts: hard mattresses, mice, drafts, poor ventilation, servants constantly present. For the working classes, every night followed a predictable pattern. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the fire was tended for the final time, the house dimmed into darkness. Those who had candles, and most did not, used them sparingly. Tallow candles smelled unpleasant and dripped wax everywhere. They were a fire hazard. Most people did without. A small oil lamp or a burning log might provide a final few minutes of visibility, and then people rested. Sleep came in fragments. First sleep, then waking, then second sleep. During the waking period, some people prayed, others talked quietly. Some simply stared into the darkness. There were no distractions, no schedules, no concept of bedtime in the way we now understand it. One slept when it was dark and work was done, and one woke when it was light or when duty called. In monasteries, this meant rising in the middle of the night for prayer. In villages, it meant tending to the animals or stoking the fire. In castles, it might mean checking the safety of gates or attending to a crying child. But throughout the land, for most people, sleep was not a refuge. It was an interruption in the labor of life, a pause in the endless cycle of doing. And so, every night, people across the known world lay down, not with expectations, not with comfort, not with peace, but with quiet surrender. They breathed the smoke-thick air, listened to the breathing of others, and drifted off into whatever sleep came. We begin to see that the routines and experiences around sleeping in the Middle Ages were not just habits or traditions, but deeply embedded patterns that shaped nearly every part of a person's life. Patterns repeated over generations, across regions, across classes, across cold winters and humid summers, across small villages, bustling towns, stone castles, and lonely farmhouses. The truth is that medieval sleep, especially for the lower classes who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, was not defined by comfort or choice or health, but by physical need, exhaustion, and necessity. Day after day, work demanded their strength, and at night, their bodies collapsed under the burden of those demands. The layout of homes was simple, often consisting of a single multi-purpose room that functioned as kitchen, workshop, and sleeping area. That space was dark after sundown, as candles were expensive, oil was scarce, and the fire's glow was relied on for the final hours of visibility. Most peasants didn't own beds in the modern sense. They didn't sleep with pillows, mattresses, or structured bedding. Instead, straw was piled loosely in a corner or spread on a raised platform if one existed. People slept in their clothes, usually layered with other clothing, blankets, or pieces of cloth, whatever was available. Garments were rarely washed. Washing was done only a few times a year, often in rivers, and involved labor-intensive soaking, beating, drying. Lice, fleas, and dirt were simply part of the human experience, tolerated by all classes. To be clean, fully clean, was rare. Bedding absorbed sweat, illness, mold, crumbs, dampness, and insects. People shook out their bedding from time to time, but it was not replaced regularly. A child might sleep on the same straw bedding for a year, as long as it wasn't completely falling apart. The idea of replacing a mattress seasonally or having a second blanket for comfort was unheard of in most homes. They slept on what they had, even if it smelled, even if it was damp, even if it had visible pests inside. This was simply how things were taught during particularly cold months. Families used livestock to help maintain warmth. A goat, pig, or dog would be brought inside the home and allowed to lie near the sleepers. The additional body heat made a real difference. Children were often placed between adults to conserve warmth, while the elderly were placed closest to the fire. Those further from the hearth often woke with numb fingers or frostbitten toes. People knew which parts of the house were warmest and assigned sleeping spots accordingly. But even with strategic placement, nights were cold. Very cold. And while noble families had better protection, thicker walls, higher beds, and sometimes fire in the room itself, they too had to deal with drafts, stone-cold air, and nighttime chills. Curtains were used not only for privacy, but to try to block out drafts that snuck in through cracks in shutters or stonework. In castles, the thickness of the stone provided some insulation, but it also held onto the chill. Servants slept on the floor or in hallways. In some cases, small beds were kept near the master's chambers for immediate service. These were not luxurious beds. They were narrow, hard, and exposed to the same temperature extremes as everyone else. Most people went to sleep soon after sundown. The sun set early in winter, and since there was little to do in the dark, people often lay down not long after eating their final meal. This evening meal was typically simple: leftover stew, bread, or porridge. Food was eaten with fingers or wooden spoons. Afterward, dishes might be rinsed in a basin or set aside for the next day. Then the house slowly quieted. Small tasks might continue: fixing a tear in clothing, tending to an animal, or wiping down tools, but eventually the space dimmed. Embers were covered to prevent sparks, and the day ended. There were no clocks. Time was felt rather than tracked. People used the stars, the moon, and the sound of animals to orient themselves. In some places, church bells sounded to mark canonical hours, prime, matins, compline, but in the countryside, sound didn't always travel. Most people simply lived by routine. Sleep began when work ended, and that work was constant. Digging, lifting, walking, threshing, sewing, chopping, all of it wore the body down. By night, the weariness was heavy. Sleep wasn't something people scheduled, it was something they fell into. Segmented sleep remained common, especially before the 18th century. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then came a brief waking period. People might talk quietly, tend the fire, step outside, or simply rest in silence. Then came the second sleep. This two-part rest was natural and even referenced in writings of the time. Some believed that dreams during second sleep were more vivid. Others believed that the in-between period was ideal for prayer. It was a quiet, slow moment and a quiet, slow night. But all of it happened in the same clothes people worked in, among the same family members or fellow workers, on the same bedding that held the smells of days and weeks before. Peasants were not unique in this. Townspeople lived similarly. Bakers, blacksmiths, thatchers, weavers, all had simple homes. Shared sleeping arrangements, no heat beyond a fire, and little to separate one day from the next. The furniture was sparse, a chest, a bench, maybe a stool. Beds were built in or makeshift. Sometimes families owned one proper bed for the parents, and children slept on the floor. Other times, there was no bed at all. In monasteries. Sleep was governed by strict rules. Monks often slept in dormitories, lined up in rows, fully clothed with minimal blankets. They were woken at regular intervals to attend services, sometimes multiple times per night. Sleep was interrupted, intentional, and ascetic. Comfort was not the goal. Monks believed sleep was a potential path to sin. Too much rest weakened discipline. Therefore, sleep was permitted only in small amounts. They awoke early and slept little. But even outside monasteries, sleep was shallow. Noises, discomfort, and cold broke up the night. People slept lightly, woke frequently, and rarely felt truly rested. But because they were used to this pattern, they didn't question it. Life didn't offer alternatives. And so they endured night after night, year after year, generation after generation, lying in the same dim light, beneath the same scratchy covers, beside the same snoring siblings, under the same old roof, with the same draft touching their feet. Uneventful and deeply repetitive journey into medieval nightly life, we continue exploring the quiet, cold, and monotonous rituals of sleeping in the Middle Ages, where the experiences surrounding rest were shaped not by choice or preference, but by practical necessity and limited resources, and where every night looked remarkably like the one before, with little variation, little novelty, and almost no room for luxury or comfort. The ordinary medieval sleeper, whether a field laborer, a woodcutter, a miller, or a shepherd, would end their day not with ceremony or expectation, but with physical fatigue and resignation. The house, which was often a single shared room, served as both living space and sleeping space. The air in that space was thick, not just with smoke from the fire, but with the lingering smell of unwashed clothing, stale food, damp straw, and the breath of people and animals alike. Most households didn't have chimneys. Smoke exited through a hole in the roof or simply stayed inside. This meant that bedding, if you could call it that, absorbed smoke constantly, along with moisture, sweat, dirt, and cooking grease. Blankets were not changed seasonally. Most families only owned one, and it was shared. In homes with more than one family member, sleep became a group activity. In homes with servants, apprentices, or guests, people simply rearranged themselves. To make space, children might sleep at the feet of adults, or next to the hearth, or in corners. Older family members might be placed closest to the fire. Those sleeping farthest from it often woke up cold, even numb. Bedding was not rotated or aired out regularly. In fact, it might not leave the house for months. Straw beds collected food, scraps, insects, dirt, and waste. No cleaning routine was in place. Fleas were common. Lice were constant. People itched themselves in the dark. Babies cried and were soothed, often with song or touch, not because there was time or peace to do so, but because it was part of what one did while falling into a thin, cold sleep. When a medieval person went to bed, there was no evening ritual in the modern sense. There were no candles scented with herbs, no self-lighting, no brushing of teeth, no pajamas, no mindfulness routines. Instead, there was firelight, dull orange, smoky, and faint, and garments already worn all day, unchanged and stiff. The same tunic that had seen dirt, sweat, and labor was what people wrapped around themselves for warmth. In colder regions, outer garments, cloaks, capes, shawls were sometimes shared or folded over feet. Socks were rare. Shoes were removed only if it made sense to do so. Some people kept them on all night. This especially applied to those sleeping on cold floors or near doors. In rainy months, the bedding itself often remained damp. Straw clumped, cloth froze, feet cracked from exposure. And yet people continued to sleep in these conditions, not because they preferred them, but because there were no alternatives. Fire could only warm a small radius. Those nearest it might doze comfortably. Those farther away woke frequently. Waking in the middle of the night was common. Without clocks, people knew roughly what time it was based on how the fire looked, how the air felt, or how long they'd already been lying down. The first phase of sleep might last 3 to 4 hours. Then came a short waking period, during which people sometimes whispered to each other, adjusted the fire, tended to babies, or simply stared into the darkness, followed by a second sleep. This two-part pattern has been documented in writing. From the period, it was not considered strange. It was natural, part of the nightly rhythm, as ordinary as breathing. Monks and religious communities followed stricter schedules. Sleep was deliberately interrupted by prayer. In some monasteries, bells rang before dawn, or even at midnight, calling monks to matins. They would rise, fully clothed, and walk barefoot or in sandals to cold stone chapels, where they stood, chanted, and prayed. Then they returned to bed or continued their duties. Their dormitories were bare rows of straw mattresses or wooden planks. The cold was seen as a form of discipline. Blankets were few. Speaking was forbidden. No comfort was expected. Sleep was functional, no more, no less. Even in castles and noble homes, comfort was limited. Although wealthy families had more space and softer bedding, the structural cold of stone walls and lack of insulation meant that rooms remained frigid. Bed curtains helped block drafts. Canopy beds were common among nobles, but not for decoration. They existed to trap body heat. Servants warmed beds with heated stones, but only for brief moments. The warmth faded quickly. Servants themselves often slept nearby, on floors or in trunks, ready to serve. Even royalty experienced cold feet, pest infestations, and poor sleep. The difference was degree, not kind got in towns, where houses were crammed together and families shared space with tenants, apprentices, and workers. Sleeping conditions were noisy and cramped. Above a bakery or workshop, entire families might sleep in the loft, on the floor, near storage bins, or under tables. The smell of flour, smoke, old cheese, and unwashed skin filled the air. Noise from the street outside, merchants shouting, dogs barking, carts rattling, leaked into homes with thin walls and gaps in doors. There were no sound barriers, no peace. And yet people slept because they were tired. The daily grind of hauling water, chopping wood, scrubbing cloth, walking to markets, and working long hours in fields or trades made sleep less of a question and more of a physical inevitability. Even if comfort was absent, the body demanded rest. Sleep came not as luxury, but as surrender dot, and so every evening, all across medieval Europe, from the forests of Germany to the fields of France to the coastal towns of England, people slowly settled into the same nightly routine, tending the fire, adjusting the bedding, folding a wool tunic beneath the head as a pillow, lying down beside siblings, parents, workers, animals, or nothing at all, and breathing slowly into the silence. The day ended with the same tasks, and the night brought the same sleep, day after day, week after week, year after year. This was not exceptional. This was ordinary. And in that ordinariness, we find the true pattern of medieval sleep: slow, shared, cold, shallow, and eternal. For those living in the countryside, especially the majority who toiled as agricultural laborers, the rhythm of sleep was as closely tied to the land as their work. The seasons dictated not only what they did by day, but how they rested by night. In the warmer months, with the sun lingering longer in the sky, the day's labor extended well into the evening. People returned home late, weary and dust-covered, with skin tanned from the sun or burned red depending on the region. Fields had to be tended, animals managed, and grain harvested or stored. These chores could not be paused, and there were no days off except perhaps certain church feast days. After eating their course meal, usually pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, or bread dipped in oil or vinegar, the family would settle in for the night, each person falling into their usual sleeping spot without much ceremony. Bedding may have been flattened during the day to make space for other uses, or simply remain there as a fixture of the home. If it was shared space, the same old straw-filled mattress or matted blankets would be spread out again. The smell of sweat from the day mixed with the earthy scent of straw and dust, forming an odor neither new nor unbearable. It was simply what homes smelled like dot in the colder months. Sleep was more difficult to obtain. The biting chill seeped through walls, around door edges, and down from poorly sealed thatched roofs. Without insulation, and with fires that dwindled overnight, families huddled closer together. Infants were sometimes wrapped in animal pelts or swaddled in cloth scraps tucked under their mother's blanket. Small children might lie directly on sheepskin if available. If not, they lay on whatever fabric or flattened bundle of rushes the household could spare. Clothing was reused as insulation outer cloaks draped across feet, work tunics spread out to form makeshift quilts. It was not uncommon for families to sleep in layers of clothing that were never removed except during rare bathings, which were often seasonal and depended on access to water and warmth. Personal hygiene was not neglected out of ignorance, but out of survival. Heating enough water, removing clothes in freezing weather, and maintaining privacy all presented real difficulties. Thus, sleep took place with the day's grime still. Clinging to skin and with the same clothes that had been worn for labor, blankets were few and shared by all. Wool was the most common material, often coarse and itchy, but durable and warm. If families had access to furs, they were used primarily by the oldest members or newborns. Silence, though not complete, crept in after the fire was lowered. A few faint murmurs might pass between bedmates, but most households were too exhausted. For long conversations, some whispered a prayer. Others traced the sign of the cross over their chests before drifting into sleep. In towns and cities, the noise from outside might persist longer. Dogs barking, drunken men shouting, the creak of wooden wheels, the slam of a shop door, the tolling of a church bell. These noises blended with indoor sounds, the creak of floorboards as someone rolled over, the faint rustle of mice behind a wall, the slow hiss of a dying ember. These were not disruptions, but accepted sounds of life. In a world without sealed windows or double walls, sound traveled easily. Town dwellers who might live above a shop or in an attached row house accepted a sleep environment filled with background noise. Even among the noble classes, nightly routines remained more functional than luxurious. Though a wealthy family might own several beds, often elevated on wooden frames and surrounded by heavy drapes or curtains, those beds still lacked the softness and cleanliness modern sleepers take for granted. Mattresses were filled with straw or feathers if affordable, but they flattened quickly and required regular beating to maintain shape. Linens might be washed more frequently than in peasant homes, but still not often. Pillows, where they existed, were small and dense. Servants occasionally warmed the beds with heated stones or metal warming pans filled with coals. These were carefully wrapped in cloth and passed through the bed before sleep, but they cooled quickly. The heat rarely lasted an hour. Bedrooms were not heated independently. Fires were small and usually located in one central hall, with warmth traveling weekly into individual chambers. Some noble families slept in shared spaces during winter months to preserve body heat, even if the castle had multiple rooms. Servants slept close by, sometimes in the same room, ready to respond if called. Among the very wealthy or religious elite, there were occasional mentions of more structured nightly rituals. A noblewoman might brush her hair before sleep, or a monk might recite extended prayers, but even these acts occurred under poor lighting, often by the dim flame of a single candle or rushlight. Time was tracked only in general terms. Bells, sun position, and habit informed the sleep cycle. Most people could not read clocks, and few clocks existed outside of major religious buildings or towns. This meant that waking and sleeping were based on repetition and physical need rather than measured schedules. The average person knew it was time to sleep because it was too dark to see and too cold to stay upright. They woke not because an alarm sounded, but because the fire had gone out. The rooster crowed, or the air changed with the first light. There was also the ever-present awareness that night could bring danger. Fire was feared. A stray ember left uncovered could ignite straw bedding or roof thatch. Entire villages had burned this way. Illness, too, often struck at night. A child might develop a fever, a cough could worsen, an elderly person might not wake up. There were no emergency services, no doctors to call, no hospitals nearby. Remedies were kept in the home, dried herbs, poultices, and prayers. Death was common, and sleep often merged into dying without much fanfare. People didn't expect long lifespans, and they didn't treat sleep as a precious health tool. It was simply the period between labor dot, and yet, despite all these hardships, people slept. They slept not because their beds were soft, or their rooms were warm, or their minds were calm, but because sleep was a requirement of life. It came for everyone: child, parent, noble, monk, tradesman, servant. It came in shared rooms and barns, on dirt floors, in castle chambers, and monastic dormitories. It came without comfort and without complaint. It was a space between survival tasks. It was a return to stillness. No matter how the day had gone, whether crops failed or succeeded, whether a marriage was arranged or an argument broke out, whether someone was born or someone died, night always came, and with it, the same ritual. Lie down, cover yourself. With what you have, close your eyes, and listen to the breathing of those around you. Sleep, such as it was, would follow. The cycle continued. After one day ended, another began, and between those long, repetitive days of work and hardship came the lull. repetitive nights of sleep, or at least the attempt to sleep, in conditions that changed very little from one season to the next, or from one generation to another. The pattern of medieval sleep was not varied, creative, or reinvented. It was enduring, slow, and practical. In most households across Europe, sleep was not a matter of individual comfort, but of collective routine. The fire was reduced to embers, the doors were barred with heavy wood or stone, and everyone, from toddlers to grandparents, settled into the same resting places. The spaces were tight, the air was thick, and there was nothing left to do. Without entertainment, without privacy, and without even light to see by, the only real option was to lie down, wrap yourself in whatever scratchy fabric you had, and try not to let your feet get too cold. And so the night passed, slowly, heavily, quietly. People did not expect to wake refreshed. They did not expect to dream. They did not track sleep quality. They did not talk about sleep schedules or sleep hygiene. These ideas did not exist. What existed instead was the physical demand of sleep, the collapsing of the body after a full day of hauling, lifting, grinding, mending, walking, and enduring. The reward for that effort was not softness or peace, but only rest. Hard-earned, often shallow, sometimes interrupted rest. Among peasants, this routine was rarely questioned. There was no reason to question it. Their parents had done the same, and their grandparents before them. A man worked the fields until the light faded. A woman managed the home, the children, the laundry, the goats, and the bread. Children were tasked with chores from the age of 5 or 6, fetching water, gathering kindling, chasing hens, carrying messages. Everyone was tired by nightfall. Sleep came because it had to. In wealthier homes, things were not dramatically different. Yes, there were more rooms. Yes, there were servants who lit fires or fetched bedpans. Yes, there were feather beds and embroidered pillows in some chambers. But the cold still crept in, the lice still came, the coughs still echoed. And even the noble class slept fully clothed, with their chamber pots under the bed and their dogs curled at their feet for warmth. They too experienced segmented sleep. They too woke up coughing or turning or hearing the wind howl outside. The shudders. The main difference was that their daylight hours were less exhausting. A noble might spend the day reading, hunting, attending court, or walking the gardens. A peasant spent the same day bent over frozen soil or struggling to grind enough grain for the next day's bread. The sleep itself, however, remained shaped by similar forces: darkness, fatigue, and silence. One must also remember the absence of furniture as we know it. Most homes, especially peasant dwellings, did not contain multiple beds or chairs or shelves. They had a hearth, a chest, perhaps a bench, and piles of bedding in the corners. Wealthier homes had wooden bed frames, and those beds were considered valuable items passed down through generations, maintained by household servants, and protected from dampness and rot. Even so, the structure of the bed did little to improve the actual sleep experience, especially in winter months, when even the bed curtains could not fully block the freezing air and the stone walls remained cold to the touch. It was not uncommon for nobles to wear hats or coifs to bed. Their night clothes were thicker versions of day garments. Slippers were placed by the bed, not for luxury, but to keep bare feet from touching frozen floors. Warming pans, metal devices filled with embers, were moved through the sheets before sleep, but only briefly, as they posed a risk of fire if left too long. Children slept with parents. Servants slept in the same room, sometimes just behind. The curtains. Privacy was nearly non-existent in monasteries. The sleep process was dictated by the rules of the order. Cistercians, for example, observed strict silence and slept fully dressed in shared dormitories. Their sleep was broken by bells calling them to prayers at intervals throughout the night. Some rose before midnight for matins. After chanting by candlelight, they returned to their sleeping platforms, usually hard and without much bedding. Sleep was seen as a necessary weakness, something to limit, not indulge in. Monks wrote of resisting sleep, purifying the mind, or practicing self-denial in the night. And yet, even they were not free from the ordinary difficulties of sleep, the cold, the discomfort, the occasional infestation of bugs, or the aching limbs from a hard stone floor. Town life introduced another layer of sound and disruption, unlike the countryside where nights were quiet save for the wind or the lowing of animals. Towns remained lively after sundown. Narrow cobblestone streets echoed with footsteps. Inns, taverns, and alehouses continued business late into the evening. Drunks passed by, singing or shouting. Traders and night watchmen made their rounds. Bakers often started their work before dawn, filling the air with the sound of wood ovens being stoked and dough being kneaded. If a family lived above a workshop, the warmth from the hearth below might rise and offer slight comfort, but the smoke and noise also traveled upward. These sounds were not isolated. There were no sealed windows, no insulation, no thick curtains. Sound entered easily, and it blended with the creaks of wood and the sounds of others breathing nearby. A baby cried, a rat scurried across the rafters, someone murmured in their sleep. These moments passed without much comment. They were routine. Illness also shaped sleep. Without modern medicine, many people went to sleep unsure if they would wake up feeling better or worse. A cough could signal pneumonia. A fever might lead to death. Midwives and herbalists offered help where they could, but the night remained a time of vulnerability. People placed charms above their beds or kept small religious tokens nearby, crosses, saint medallions, or bits of scripture. Prayers were spoken, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. It was understood that sleep carried the soul into a space where it could be touched by both angels and demons. Dreams were often interpreted as signs. Some people feared sleep itself, especially when ill. Others saw it as a small escape, however imperfect, from pain. Over time, these nightly routines became tradition. Children grew up watching their parents lay out the straw, stoke the fire, say the final prayers, and wrap themselves in old cloaks. As they aged, they did the same. There were no questions about routines because there were no alternatives. No one slept on soft foam. No one adjusted their bed's firmness. No one used lavender oil or white noise machines. There was only the fire, the straw, the clothing, and the slow passage of darkness. People slept because they had to, and when they couldn't sleep, they stayed quiet for the sake of others, for the sake of the morning, and for the sake of keeping order in the house. Night continued as it always did, without ceremony, without urgency, and without comfort and sleep, as it had for generations, came not as a gentle escape, but as a slow collapse into stillness. In the homes of laborers, artisans, washerwomen, coopers, and cobblers, the day's final moment arrived not with choice, but with exhaustion. There were no rituals to prepare for bed. The act of lying down was not separate from the flow of the day, but its final motion, when muscles could no longer carry weight, when light had disappeared, when warmth had faded from the hearth. For those sleeping on the floor or straw platforms, the distinction between waking and sleeping was thin. A man might rest his back against a wall and doze there until the dawn returned. A child might fall asleep while still chewing the crust of bread left from the evening meal. It was not unusual for people to drift off mid-sentence or mid-task. Fatigue came like gravity, steady, silent, constant. And once sleep took hold, it rarely resembled the peaceful, undisturbed rest modern sleepers imagine. It was fragmented, shallow, and often broken by sounds temperature changes, or bodily discomfort. Without structured beds, without cushioning, without bedding that conformed to the body, people shifted, often readjusting limbs, pulling garments over their shoulders, tucking cold hands beneath arms, rolling away from drafts, scratching at itches, or simply staring into darkness when sleep refused to return. For most, the body's discomfort was a constant companion. Joints ached, backs stiffened. Muscles remained sore from repetitive motion. There was no concept of orthopedic support, no alignment of the spine, no notion that a better mattress could improve health. One slept however one could. Some used wooden headdress, others lay flat. A woven sack stuffed with old wool might serve as a pillow. Others folded a tunic or placed a bundle of straw beneath their neck. Beds were for rest, not recovery. Illnesses were slept through, not treated. If someone became feverish or delirious in the night, others nearby continued to sleep unless the noise became too loud. A child might wake crying, and an older sibling would simply turn over, waiting for the sound to stop. The air inside the home was often thick from the smoke of the hearth, the damp breath of sleepers, the scent of aging straw, and the ever-present odors of animals, mold, and decay. No windows were opened. Windows, where they existed, were small, covered in horn or oiled cloth, not glass. The cold that slipped in was not fresh, just more discomfort. The larger the household, the more complex the sleeping arrangement, and homes. With apprentices, travelers, servants, or extended family, every inch of floor was sometimes claimed. People slept head to toe to conserve space. If someone had lice or scabies, others likely caught it. Children often shared not only beds, but clothing, blankets, and eating utensils. The transmission of disease was a part of life, and the night did nothing to slow it. Even the upper classes were not immune. In castles and manors, shared spaces were still the norm. A lady-in-waiting might sleep on a pallet near her mistress. A guard might rest outside a nobleman's chamber. Servants moved through halls at night, tending fires, refilling chamber pots, or preparing early meals. There was movement at all hours, especially in large households. In monasteries, a bell might sound in the middle of the night, calling the brothers to prayer. Even those who were not summoned would hear it. Silence was observed, but stillness was not always achieved. Seasonal changes brought predictable discomfort. In spring, dampness returned. Straw bedding took on a musty smell. Rats reemerged in rafters. In summer, the heat grew thick and oppressive. Insects crawled from corners, and bites appeared on skin without warning. There were no nets, no screens, no sprays. In autumn, chill winds returned through door frames. Blankets were rotated, if available, but often simply reused. In winter, warmth became the central concern. Straw was piled higher. Fires were banked more carefully. People slept closer together. Animals were sometimes brought inside to add body heat. A piglet under the bed, a dog curled at the foot, even a goat in the corner. These were not pets. They were living heaters. The smell they brought with them was tolerated. Heat was more important. The idea of a bedroom as a separate room was rare. Rooms were multi-purpose. In the morning, the same space where people had slept was used for cooking, cleaning, eating, mending, or praying. Beds were folded up, bedding shaken out, the fire stoked again. Children were sent to collect wood or water. Adults began their work. The division between night and day was not hard, but gradual. The same tools used at night, the fire poker, the water basin, the shared cloak, were used again by day. There was no pause, just a shift in light and motion over the centuries. The structure of homes slowly evolved. Chimneys became more common. Glass windows began to appear in wealthy homes. Beds became sturdier, mattresses thicker, Tapestries were used to insulate walls. But for most, especially those in villages, change came slowly. The sleep of a 13th century peasant was not so different from that of a 10th century one. And even by the 15th century, in many rural parts of Europe, homes and sleep arrangements remained unchanged. People still slept in groups. They still used straw. They still wore their work clothes to bed. They still rose with the light and slept when the dark came. Night was not romanticized. It was endured. Dreams were sometimes spoken of. If a dream was remembered, it was often shared with family or neighbors the next day. Some believed dreams carried messages from God or omens of illness. Others dismissed them. There were no dream journals, no discussions of lucid dreaming. Sleep was not a place for exploration. It was merely a time when the body stopped moving. If the soul traveled, it returned quietly. If it did not, no one was surprised. Death was never far from sleep. And so each night, across the countryside, behind castle walls, inside city shops, in abbeys and barns and cottages and towers, the people of medieval Europe did what they always had. They closed their eyes, pulled coarse cloth over their shoulders, shifted their limbs into the least uncomfortable position, and waited for the stillness of sleep to take them. In that long stretch of stillness between the dimming of the fire and the arrival of dawn, sleep held its place as a silent requirement. It was not a subject of interest or pride, not something people discussed with detail or reflection. It was simply something one did, in the same way one ate or worked or breathed. The medieval sleeper did not consider their sleep unusual or noteworthy. They did not analyze their dreams, adjust their habits, or worry about the number of hours. Time was not measured by clocks, but by cycles of nature, birds calling, roosters crowing, the gradual graying of the sky. And in that time between dusk and morning, as bodies lay close to the earth, across floors, benches, pallets, and makeshift bedding, they existed in a space of quiet fatigue. The darkness was complete. There were no glowing embers of technology, no ticking of machinery, no bright lights from streets or lanterns. The night was thick, absolute, and without entertainment. Sleep came because nothing else remained in rural communities. Sleep was dictated entirely by the structure of daily labor. There was no option to adjust it. Crops had to be sown, animals fed, tools repaired, fences rebuilt. And when the day's work was finished, and the final scraps of food consumed, and the fire safely lowered, sleep happened, not with ritual, but as a mechanical end to function. One did not ease into rest. One arrived there by necessity. Across the narrow interiors of peasant homes, people arranged themselves side by side or at angles. There was no space to stretch out, knees bent, shoulders hunched, bodies curled for warmth. In summer, the air thickened and sleep became sticky and restless. Insects bit, sweat pooled. People removed layers but did not bathe. In winter, multiple layers remained on through the night, and the straw beneath them held the cold longer than the bodies above it. People awoke stiff, cramped, and sore. They did not complain. These sensations were part of life. A family of 6 might sleep in one room, together on straw, perhaps with a pet pig or a dog close by. The walls were low, the thatch overhead often moldy or riddled with insects. In high wind, the roof creaked. In storms, it dripped. Rain entered. Straw soured. Blankets stayed damp. There were no alternatives. Bedding was not changed. There was no linen cupboard, no spare set of sheets. A single blanket, sometimes woven from coarse wool or patched from old clothing, served the entire group. Some slept, sitting up, leaning against walls or one another, snoring, coughing, mumbling in sleep. These sounds filled the space, but they were not disruptive. They were expected. Everyone had heard them since birth. There was no such thing as personal space and sleep. A child might sleep with their head against a sibling's stomach. A father might curl his legs around a dog to share heat. A mother might keep a hand resting across two children at once. The body adopted dot and towns, where buildings stacked upon each other and spaces were even tighter. Sleep was more chaotic. Shared walls meant shared noise. A child cried in one house. It was heard in three others. A man stumbled in from an alehouse below. The noise echoed up wooden staircases. Vendors passed early in the morning, waking entire streets with their shouting. Sleep was possible, but never protected. There were no shutters thick enough, no walls insulated enough to silence the world. Upstairs from the smithy, a family might lie awake at dawn as hammers rang below them. Sleep came in fragments, a few hours here, a few hours there. Yet people functioned. They had no choice, even within noble households, where large beds with curtains and cushions existed. The experience of sleep remained shaped by the environment. A noble's bed might be raised and surrounded by drapes, but the air in the room was still cold. The stone walls radiated dampness. Windows, if they had glass, let in drafts. Floors were uncarpeted. A servant might warm the bed with a pan of coals, but the effect faded quickly. Sometimes the pan scorched the sheets. Heavy bed hangings helped retain heat, but also trapped stale air. Bedfellows might include spouses, children, or favored servants. Sleep was slightly more private, but not wholly solitary. Even the wealthy shared space. Religious figures followed strict rules. A monk or nun slept in regulated hours, with interruptions for prayer. Their beds were simple, planks or thin straw, one blanket, no pillow. Some used wooden pillows to prevent oversleeping. Self-denial extended to rest. In some orders, monks rose multiple times per night for chanting or meditation. The sleep they allowed themselves was short, controlled, and never indulgent. It was not for recovery, but for obedience. Even so, their nights resembled others, cold, quiet, repetitive, medical. Knowledge about sleep was limited. People knew that sleep was necessary, but did not know why. Some believed too much sleep weakened the spirit. Others believed certain dreams foretold sickness or death. A doctor might recommend herbs or charms to assist with sleep. Poppy seeds, valerian, or mugwort were used in simple preparations. Smells were believed to affect dreams. A cloth soaked in vinegar might be placed near the head. Some placed garlic or onions beneath pillows to ward off evil spirits. But for most people, such practices were unnecessary. They slept because their bodies demanded it, and they awoke not because they were rested, but because the rooster crowed, the wind changed, or someone nearby stirred. There was no language to describe sleep quality. People did not say, "I slept well," or "I tossed and turned." They simply resumed their work. Fatigue was expected. Complaining did not stop the next task. Sleep was part of survival, not wellness. The absence of comfort was universal. And over time, this acceptance became ingrained. Children learned these habits early. They slept in corners or beside parents, using cloaks or wool as covers. Infants were swaddled tightly and placed in cradles near the fire. Older children slept with siblings or animals. There was no bedtime story, no brushing of teeth, no discussion. When the fire faded, they lay down. That was all. If they talked, it was in hushed tones. If they had nightmares, they were told to say a prayer and go back to sleep. Sleep was not for attention. It was for silence. As morning came, it brought no alarm or signal, only a shift in light. The room grew slightly brighter. The air changed. People stirred. Someone stoked the fire. Someone fetched water. A child cried. A dog shook its coat. The day resumed. and the night in all its discomfort faded behind them, not cherished, not remembered, just repeated. Each night settled the same way. There were no clocks to count down the hours, no lamps to dim, no routines to follow beyond what was needed to keep warm and safe. The fire was tended one last time, not for ambience, but survival. If there was enough wood or dried dung, it was pressed into embers. If not, it would die out. People arranged themselves where space allowed. The youngest might curl beside their parents, the elderly closer to the hearth, and others along the walls or wherever straw had been laid. There were no separate bedrooms, no door to close for quiet. The sounds of others, breathing, shifting, coughing, snoring, filled the air. These were not disturbing. They were part of the soundscape, familiar, known. In many homes, sleep did not begin in silence, but under a steady layer of human noise. The child's soft movements, the slow rubbing of calloused feet, the mutter of someone halfway to dreaming. Silence, if it came, was temporary. There was always a new sound, a pot settling, a breeze rattling the thatch, a dog barking outside, or someone waking briefly to turn over, adjust a blanket, or tend to a child, across. Most regions, the first sleep began shortly after dark. It might last 3 to 4 hours. Then came a natural period of wakefulness, sometimes called the watch. This was not feared, it was expected. People might talk softly, pray, feed a baby, or simply lie still, waiting for the second. Sleep to come. There was no frustration about this break. No tossing or sighing. People knew this was how sleep worked. It was not a sign of restlessness or illness. It was a pause, natural and accepted. In wealthier homes, candles might be lit. Briefly. In poorer ones, only the faint light from embers or moon through a crack in the wall illuminated the room. After an hour or two, people settled again. The second sleep would carry them to dawn in villages. The sleep cycle mirrored the agricultural calendar, and summer sleep began later. There was more light, more work to do, more warmth to manage. Homes stayed hotter longer. It was harder to sleep with so many bodies packed into a small space, especially when the air did not move. Sweat formed easily. There were no baths before bed, no fresh linens. Clothing stuck to skin. Insects were everywhere. Flies buzzed around the thatch. Mosquitoes bit exposed arms and ankles. Lice were a constant issue, and fleas lived in the bedding itself. People scratched without thinking. It was not considered unclean. It was simply a fact of life. In winter, sleep came earlier. Darkness arrived before supper. The cold sent people to bed faster, wrapped in cloaks, shawls, and whatever layers they could gather. The straw felt damp and unforgiving, but there was nowhere else to lie. In the worst months, sleep might be interrupted by the need to feed a fire, check on animals, or move closer to someone for warmth. Firewood was scarce. Dung burned faster. The nights were long and cold. Among townsfolk, especially in trades like bakers, blacksmiths, and brewers, sleep was fragmented by the needs of the craft. Bakers rose long before dawn. Their apprentices sometimes never fully slept, but rather napped in intervals around kneading dough and heating ovens. Smiths who worked with horses might be woken to shoe an animal arriving late. Brewers kept watch on their batches. Merchants, too, often slept lightly, anxious about goods, money, or theft. And in every town, watchmen patrolled with slow footsteps and lanterns, tapping walls or calling out to mark the hour. Their sound drifted through windows, around corners, between wooden buildings. Some found this reassuring. Others simply ignored it. The towns were alive at night, not bustling, but never truly silent. Even inside castles and manors, where luxury was visible in furniture, decoration, and clothing, the act of sleep was still ruled by practical concerns. A noble's bed might be tall, canopied, and carved from heavy wood, but the room was drafty. Curtains blocked wind, but also trapped air. Fires might be lit in the chamber, but most heat escaped through stone walls and high ceilings. Servants warmed the bedding with pans of coals. Chamber pots were placed nearby. The smell was ignored. In the middle of the night, if a child cried or a servant stirred, others would hear. There were no true walls, only screens or doors that creaked open easily. Bed partners were common. A spouse, a lady in waiting, a young child, all might share the space. Sleep was segmented by status, but not always by experience. Even nobles got cold. Even nobles woke up itchy or stiff-dot in monasteries. The rules of sleep were specific. Monks rose several times per night to pray. The first bell could ring at midnight, followed by chanting in a cold stone chapel. Their return to sleep was brief. They lay down again on narrow beds, wooden planks or simple pallets. There was no luxury. Blankets were plain. Clothing remained on. Speaking was forbidden. The goal was not rest, but discipline. To sleep too long was a temptation. To resist, it was holy. Some monks even wrote about the struggle to remain alert during prayer, especially in winter, when warmth and darkness pressed down heavily. But the effort was part of the spiritual path. Illness complicated sleep. There were no hospitals for most. The sick remained in their bedding, whether a noble in a curtained bed or a peasant on the floor. Fevers worsened at night. Sweat pooled. Breathing changed. Family members listened quietly, unsure if the next sound would be relief or silence. Prayers were whispered. Holy relics were kept close. Herbs were burned. Sleep became a space of risk. For the old, every night could be their last. And yet, this was understood. Death was part of life. If someone did not wake, the body was wrapped, and life went on. Children did not have separate rooms. They were born into shared space, slept in shared beds, and learned to fall asleep among movement and noise. There was no effort to silence. The house for a child, they adapted. Babies were swaddled not for comfort, but to keep them from injury or cold. Young children sometimes slept under tables, behind crates, or beside animals. There were no toys, no songs beyond what was sung by a tired mother or grandmother, no expectation of ease. A child who stirred was gently patted, then told to hush dot as the night deepened. Sleep settled again. People turned, shifted, sighed, and sank back into warmth, or what passed for it. The fire was now embers, the cold pressed in. Dreams, if. They came when unspoken, bodies grew still. The house grew quiet, and the cycle, endlessly familiar, continued without notice. Sleep, as it had for centuries, simply filled the hours between one day's burden and the next. In the darker corners of medieval towns and villages, as the night stretched on, some few remained awake by necessity, duty, or discomfort. A mother with a sick infant rocked gently in the dark. A servant paced the corridor of a manor house, ears trained for the sound of a bell or a call. A farmer, too old for heavy labor, shifted in his bedding as cold crept into his joints. But for the rest, for those who had worked themselves into exhaustion or had nothing more to do until dawn, sleep settled in like a heavy fog. It was not deep, not restful in the modern sense, but it was stillness. Time passed without awareness. Dreams drifted faintly, not sharp or strange, but brief flickers of memory or feeling. Most were forgotten, waking came slowly. There was no sudden jolt, no digital tone. The body stirred naturally, often more than once through the night. It might turn from side to side, from hip to hip. It might sit up, half aware, to drink water or listen to some nearby sound. Then it would settle again. That was the rhythm for some. Waking during the night was expected. This period between the so-called first and second sleep had its uses. A couple might whisper, a prayer might be offered. In wealthier homes, a servant could take the opportunity to check the fire or empty a chamber pot. There were few expectations around what should be done with this time, but its occurrence was so common that it found reference even in early medical texts and religious writings. In the countryside, a shepherd might go out and check his animals during this time. In towns, a watchman might knock on doors to alert of danger or a nearby fire. In cities, this midnight moment could see quiet foot traffic, someone returning late, someone beginning an early duty. But mostly people remained in place. The darkness remained too deep to travel without risk. The world was still, and so, where its people dot in peasant homes, the space between sleeps was often filled with very little. The fire might be stirred once, but fuel was precious and sleep more valuable. A man might sit up, urinate in a clay jar or the corner of the room, then lie back down. Children might shift against one another. A mother might nurse a baby without fully waking, and then silence. Silence returned like the dark itself, thick, unquestioned. There was no conversation about it the next day. No one asked if anyone had slept well. The act of waking during the night was not noteworthy. It happened, then passed out in larger houses. The midnight interval was sometimes used more consciously. Among the literate or the devout, this might be a time for brief reading, quiet reflection, or whispered prayer. Candles were expensive, but some wealthier households kept tallow on hand for night use. A candle might be lit, placed safely in a corner, and allowed to burn just long enough to reread a passage of scripture or write a short note. A noblewoman might use the time to pray at a bedside cross or recite memorized verses. A clerk might make notes by dim light if the work demanded it, but even these uses were limited. Night remained a time of low movement, and no one ventured far from bed unless absolutely necessary. The physical spaces themselves shaped the experience. In towns where homes were narrow and tall, people often slept in upper rooms. Ladders or wooden steps connected floors. The air grew warmer higher up, but also more stale. Roofs leaked, wind rattled shutters. Insects and mice moved through rafters. Bedding, no matter how well arranged, always carried a smell of old wool, of straw, of mildew or body odor. Washing bedding was rare. It was time-consuming, expensive, and required space. Instead, people beat their straw out periodically, replaced it if it became infested, and layered cloth as needed. Some used herbs, dried lavender or mint, if available, to reduce the smell. But for most, the bedding was what it was, worn, useful, never truly clean. Children learned to sleep through everything. A crowded room, a storm, a restless adult. There were no nightlights, no soft blankets, no music. They learned quickly that night was for quiet. Crying brought shushing, talking was discouraged. Even nightmares were handled briefly. A soft pat, a whispered prayer, then sleep again. Most children were never alone. They shared beds with siblings, cousins, or even neighbors' children in some arrangements. The body adapted, so did the mind. Dreams became quieter or more private. There was little time to reflect on them by morning. Among the very poor, sleep was more exposed. Those without homes, or without enough space indoors, might sleep in stables, sheds, or even against walls and alleyways. In cities, beggars and the displaced sometimes huddled in churches or beneath market stalls. Their sleep was lighter, interrupted by cold or noise or fear of theft. Even within homes, the poorest slept closest to the door, the coldest place, the most exposed to wind and risk. There were no locks. Entry was blocked by placing a heavy object or wooden beam across the door, but safety was never guaranteed. Sleep was not secure. It was simply unavoidable. Back inside manors and castles, the separation between the sleep of masters and servants was often just a curtain or a wall of carved wood. Some servants slept in the same room, ready to be called. Others slept nearby, in corridors or under staircases. Privacy was minimal. Night movement by one often woke others. Still, those with power accepted this. It was known that having others near was the price of being served. Some nobles preferred solitude and designed chambers far from the bustle. But even then, sound traveled through stone. Servants whispered in the halls. Guards shifted outside. The wind howled through the towers. Monastic communities had their own rhythm. The night bells divided the hours. Monks rose not when they wished, but when they were summoned. The first bell could ring shortly after midnight. The community would rise, file into the chapel, chant in the dark, then return to their cells. Not all monks slept in private. Many shared dormitories. Beds were evenly spaced, assigned by order of age or duty. Conversation was forbidden. Movement was minimal. The practice of night prayers, though disruptive to sleep, was seen as spiritual vigilance. Rest was never the priority. Discipline was, and yet even monks in their writing spoke of fatigue, of nodding off during chants, of sleep taking them by accident during long winter nights. Dreams were another matter. In many households, dreams were personal and rarely shared. They were not dismissed, but not explored. Some believed that dreams could carry messages from saints, from the dead, from God. A strange dream might be mentioned to a priest or healer. But most dreams passed without comment. There were no books to write them in. No language for deep interpretation. Just the vague memory upon waking and the push to begin another day. As the sky began to lighten, the world stirred once more. The second sleep faded. A rooster crowed. A servant relieved the hearth. A mother adjusted a child's blanket. The workday had not yet begun, but rest was already ending. In cities, bakers prepared ovens. In farms, animals waited for feeding. In castles, maids moved through corridors. No one announced the morning. It arrived gradually, unmistakably. And sleep, once again, receded into the background, unnoticed and unspoken. Morning did not begin with a single moment, but with a slow sequence of sound and motion. A pot was shifted near the hearth. A latch creaked. The rooster called again, clearer this time. Feet moved across a wooden floor. These were not sharp sounds, nor sudden. They rose like steam, gradually. In homes across villages, towns, and manors, the long stillness of the night gave way to small, necessary movements. Sleep ended not because anyone decided it was time to wake, but because the world resumed. Light, even faint, was enough to start the rhythm again. There were no curtains to block the sun, no blinds to delay the morning. Where windows existed, light entered. Where there were no windows, the cracks in the walls let it seep in, all the same dot in the peasant's home. The first to rise was often the mother. She stirred the ashes to rekindle the fire. If wood or fuel was scarce, she might use dried dung or small twigs. The goal was warmth, not comfort, enough heat to boil water or cook porridge. Others woke slowly, rubbing faces, pulling cloaks tighter, stepping over each other. There was no order, no morning routine in the modern sense. Just the need to begin. The same bedding they had slept on became the space for sitting, dressing, eating. Children who had slept on sacks of straw now helped shake them out. The same clothes they had worn in sleep were brushed off and kept on for the day. Among tradespeople and townsfolk, mornings followed the demands of the craft. A blacksmith needed his forge hot before the first customer arrived. A brewer checked his barrels. A cooper examined his wood for moisture. Merchants prepared stalls. Apprentices swept shops or fetched water. Bread ovens were lit before sunrise, and the smell of smoke and yeast began to spread through narrow alleyways. There was little conversation, no greetings, just motion. Sleep was never a topic. There was no talk of dreams or rest. There was simply too much to do. Servants in noble households rose by duty. Some were already awake, those who had been up during the night, tending fires, standing guard, or watching over sick children. Others were roused early by bells, knocks, or a master's call. They lit candles, opened shutters, fetched hot water. Their own sleep was always fragmented. They rested when they could, a moment leaning against a wall. A few hours after dark, another before dawn, sleep was not a luxury. It was a gap between tasks. When those tasks resumed, rest ended. Whether the body was ready or not in castles, the day began with preparation. The lord and lady would rise later, but the house had to be ready. Bedding straightened, garments laid out, food prepared. Water warmed for washing, the great hall swept, animals fed. Nothing happened quickly, but everything happened on schedule. The servants' rooms, if they had them, emptied. A maid might still be shaking off sleep when she lit the hearth in her master's chamber, but there was no time to linger. Hesitation was not an option. Monasteries, always ruled by the bell, followed a strict sequence. Morning prayers came with the first light, sometimes even before. The monks, having slept only in short intervals, assembled without complaint. They chanted, read, then returned to their daily work, copying texts, gardening, tending livestock. The little sleep they had was seen as enough. Fatigue was treated as a challenge to overcome, not a problem to solve. Meanwhile, in rural homes, the day's hardest work had not yet begun. Breakfast was simple, often porridge, stale bread, or broth. Water had to be fetched, animals let out, fields checked, tools were examined. A broken handle or cracked blade could delay the whole morning. Children had chores, and those too young to work were carried or left in the care of siblings. Sleep for them ended with the light. There was no such thing as just 5 more minutes. The sun did not wait, nor did hunger. It is important, Joe. Remember that for most people, the night and the sleep within it were not defined by choice. There was no concept of going to bed. There was no private time to unwind, no soft transition between wakefulness and rest. People simply stopped when they could go no further. Sleep came like gravity, natural, inevitable, and without luxury, and it left just as silently, pushed aside by the first requirement of the day. There were no rituals around waking. No washing of the face in clean basins. No stretching or soft music. A man might rise and immediately begin sharpening a tool. A woman might wake and stir the pot from the night before. A child might wake already holding a small bundle of firewood. The line between sleep and labor was nearly invisible. For those who were sick, mornings were harder. A person who had grown through the night might now lie still, weaker, quieter. In many cases, there was no doctor to call. Care came from others in the room, a spouse, a sibling, a neighbor, a cloth dampened with cold water, a whispered prayer, a change of position. If the sick did not rise, someone else took their task. If they worsened, a priest might be called. If they died, the work continued after morning. Seasonal changes brought different sleep rhythms. In winter, the darkness lingered. People might wake but remain near the fire, waiting for a warmer hour to begin labor. In summer, the day came. Early and sleep ended fast. The sun climbed quickly, and so did the heat. Fields needed tending before midday. In spring and autumn, the routines shifted again. But always, sleep adjusted to nature, not the other way around. In some regions, communal. Sleep remained the only model. In long houses or shared lodgings, dozens might sleep side by side. Travelers, workers, and strangers, everyone in one space. Privacy was unknown. A person might wake with someone else's foot against their side or a child snoring nearby. It was tolerated. Complaints meant nothing. Sleep was simply what filled the hours until labor returned. Even in death, sleep was referenced. The dead were said to be at rest, asleep in the Lord, or called to eternal slumber. The language reflected the cultural understanding that sleep and death were near neighbors. Not feared, not always welcome, but accepted. The bed, the ground, the final resting place, all shared imagery. And every night, as people lay down on hard bedding, wrapped in worn cloth, and closed their eyes in the darkness, they understood this. That rest was brief, that labor would return, and that only the stillness of night separated one day's burden from the next. The rhythm of daily life in the Middle Ages was set not by clocks, but by necessity. People moved through time according to what needed doing, not what time it was. Sleep was no different. It happened when the body could no longer continue, and it ended when the world demanded action again. The idea of controlling sleep, adjusting its quality, tracking its cycles, shaping it for health, did not exist. People simply laid down and, when conditions allowed, drifted off. In many cases, they didn't even think of it as drifting. They stopped. The body paused. That was enough. The mind may or may not have followed, but there was no great expectation beyond simple unconsciousness. Beds, as we understand them now, were not common. In poor homes, a pile of straw on a dirt floor was the most one could hope for. Sometimes this straw was layered with cloth or an old blanket, but more often it was left as it was, dry if possible, but sometimes damp, always scratchy. It attracted insects. It flattened quickly. Occasionally it was replaced, but not often. A better home might elevate the bed slightly, a wooden frame perhaps, or planks nailed together. But for most, the bedding was directly on the ground, and the person lay on it fully clothed. Changing into nightwear was a privilege of the rich. Everyone else simply wore their day clothes to bed, possibly adding a cloak in colder months. These clothes were rarely washed. Sleep came in layers of dust, sweat, and whatever else the day had given dot in noble homes. Beds were larger and more complex. A frame supported ropes or boards. On top of that lay a feather mattress, or more commonly, a sack stuffed with wool, straw, or rags. Wealth allowed for coverings, sheets of linen, if available, and heavy blankets. Canopies and curtains were added, not just for decoration, but to trap heat. The bedrooms themselves were rarely heated. Fires, even in manors, were usually reserved for the great hall or kitchens. A bedroom fire was a luxury, and in some seasons, impossible. People in those rooms still woke cold, even surrounded by beauty. For peasants, the idea of a bedroom did not apply. The room was the house, the same space used for cooking, eating, repairing tools, and caring for animals was also where the family slept. Children, adults, elders, all in one room. In the poorest homes, animals shared the floor. A goat or pig might lie at the foot of the straw bedding. Chickens roosted in the rafters. These animals gave warmth, but also brought noise and smell. Sleep was not quiet. The snorting of a pig, the cluck of a hen, the shuffling of siblings, all of it blended into the background of night. But to those who lived it, this was not considered unpleasant. It was simply normal. People learned to sleep through interruption. In towns, the noise came from neighbors, wagons, late-night callers, and narrow streets. In rural areas, it came from animals, wind, and the cracking of firewood. Rarely was the night silent. Rain tapped on thatched roofs. Mice scratched in walls. Insects buzzed. A dog barked in the distance. The idea of needing quiet to sleep would have seemed strange. One slept because they were tired, not because conditions were perfect. Sleep was also communal. Solitude was rare. A traveler might find himself sleeping beside strangers at an inn, wrapped in his cloak with his belongings under his head. A family of 7 might share 2 sleeping areas, one for the parents, one for the children. Infants slept with their mothers, sometimes even swaddled tightly and hung in slings to keep them safe from being crushed. Personal space was not expected, it did not exist. To sleep in the company of others was simply the way of things in cities. Housing was cramped. Entire families might occupy a single room above a shop. Beds were built into alcoves or lined along walls. People slept close together, often on benches, floors, or wherever there was room. Heat rose through buildings, but not evenly. The top floors were often the coldest. Windows rattled, roofs leaked. Wealthier city dwellers fared slightly better, with separate rooms or cleaner sheets, but they too shared walls, noise, and interruptions. The concept of nighttime danger was never far. In towns, thieves roamed. Locks were uncommon. Doors were barred with beams, but windows could be forced. People kept knives close. In the countryside, wolves might come near. Superstitions ran deep. Some believed that evil spirits visited at night. A child with nightmares might be said to be ridden by a hag. To ward off spirits, some homes hung iron tools near doors or placed herbs under the bed. Garlic, juniper, or nettle were common protections. But even these were acts of caution, not obsession. People did what they could, then closed their eyes. There was little discussion of sleep quality. The question, "Did you sleep well?" would have puzzled most. There was no comparison point. One simply slept or didn't. A rough night might be acknowledged by the aching of bones or the heaviness of eyes, but it was not dwelled upon. There was too much to do. A laborer could not delay harvesting because of a poor night's sleep. A maid could not explain lateness with fatigue. Sleep was necessary, but never prioritized. Sleep also reflected hierarchy. Lords rose later than servants. Their day began after others had already prepared the house. A noblewoman might stay in bed longer during cold months, waiting until the room was warmed. Children of noble families might sleep alone or with a nurse. Meanwhile, the servants who tended them had already begun their day after a short, restless night in a cold chamber. Seasonal rhythms affected all. In summer, sleep came late and ended early. In winter, people spent more time in bed, but not always asleep. Nights were long. Some passed the time with quiet conversation, mending, or prayer. In colder climates, beds were shared even among those who were not family. 2 laborers might lie back to back for warmth. It was not intimate, it was survival. Among the clergy, sleep was regimented. Monks followed a strict schedule. Bells rang through the night, calling them to prayers. A monk might sleep for 3 hours, rise for matins, chant for an hour, then sleep again before lauds. Their days were structured by the liturgy, not comfort. Sleep was permitted, not pursued. Medical theories of the time offered little insight. Some believed sleep helped balance the humors. Others thought too much sleep made the body sluggish. Remedies for sleeplessness included herbs, prayers, and purging. A healer might recommend chamomile, but also bleeding or a change in diet. There was no standard. What worked for one might harm another. People experimented, then accepted the outcome. Dreams, too, held uncertain meaning. A priest might interpret them. A wife might fear them. A child might remember one in silence. Most people let dreams pass. They had no way to record them, no reason to share them, and no audience to hear them. The dream passed like smoke, real for a moment, then gone. And so, each night, as the world darkened again and firelight faded, and tools were set aside, people lay back down. On straw or wool, On planks or bare ground, beside families, strangers, or animals, they returned to sleep. Not with ceremony, not with questions. Just a brief escape from the cold, from the work, from the ache, until morning arrived again, as it always did. By the time night returned, most people had already pushed their bodies past comfort. Work did not pause because the sun was low. The final tasks of the day often extended into the twilight. In fields, the last bundles of hay were carried to storage. In villages, tools were cleaned and hung. Bread was removed from ovens. Embers were banked. And in the quiet homes across the countryside, the cycle prepared to begin again. Sleep was not looked forward to as a reward, but as a necessity. Something to be done so that work could resume again tomorrow. The idea of winding down did not exist. There were no quiet routines, no structured transitions. There was work, then sleep. And between the two, very little. Among the peasant class, there were no evenings of relaxation. Once the physical labor ended, other tasks took over. Mending clothes, repairing buckets, checking animals, preparing small meals. A mother might scrape the inside of a pot to salvage what remained. A father might sharpen a blade by the fire. Children were expected to help. A girl might spin wool. A boy might carry water or sweep the floor. These were not optional. Every task had a purpose. Every motion added value. To rest too long was to fall behind. So sleep, when it came, was often incomplete. Not from restlessness, but from sheer physical discomfort. Legs ached, hands were cracked, shoulders burned. A body did not collapse into slumber so much as fall into it out of exhaustion. Night was also when discomforts revealed themselves most clearly. The aches that were ignored during the day returned. A bad tooth throbbed more when lying down. A bent back stiffened. Cuts and blisters from fieldwork became inflamed. There were no ointments, no pills, no modern comforts. People wrapped their wounds in cloth, used herbs if they had them, and tried not to complain. Complaints, after all, did not reduce the work that awaited. The next day would come with or without rest. So people learned to close their eyes and accept whatever came, whether it was sleep, pain, or both. In town homes, the pattern was not very different, though the types of labor changed. Artisans, after finishing their daily orders, might spend evening hours prepping for the next. A leather worker cleaned tools. A potter glazed pieces by fading firelight. An apprentice swept the floors while the master tallied his coin. There were no gas lamps, no artificial light. Candles, if used, were counted carefully. Tallow was cheaper than beeswax, but still costly. A family might allow one candle to burn for the evening, and once it was gone, the night began in earnest. Darkness was the signal. Sleep followed closely behind. Even in better-off homes, sleep was not always comfortable. In wealthier homes, bedding might be thicker. The walls might block more wind, but many of the problems remained. Cold air seeped in. Vermin crept near the fire. Fleas were found even in the beds of nobles. And bedding, though finer in appearance, was rarely changed. Linen was expensive and hard to wash. Most was rinsed infrequently, if at all. Pillows, if used, were often stuffed with feathers or straw, which clumped and shifted through the night. Blankets were heavy but scratchy. And even in rooms with fireplaces, heat rose and escaped. The further from the hearth, the colder it became. In homes where a fireplace warmed the common room, sleep spaces further away became noticeably colder. Upper floors, in particular, were difficult. Roofs leaked. Smoke could collect and drip. Wind found its way through wooden shingles. The closer one was to the ground, the warmer. But space was limited. Families with many children had little choice. They made use of every corner. Closets became cribs. Benches became beds, and straw mats were arranged wherever there was floor. Left among the elderly, sleep came with more difficulty. Joints grew stiff, digestion slowed, bladders failed. Many old people awoke several times a night, moving quietly so as not to disturb others. There was no privacy, no separate room to retreat to. An old man might lie on his side, listening to the breathing of others, waiting for sleep that did not come. An old woman might sit up and adjust her shawl, whispering a prayer into the dark. These were not restless nights in the way we now think of them. They were simply part of growing old, accepted, endured, understood. Illness affected everything. A sick child might cry out during the night. A fevered man might mutter in sleep. There were no remedies beyond the basic. A cloth soaked in cold water. A mixture of crushed herbs. A whispered blessing. Sleep was often the only medicine available, and even then, it was never guaranteed. The sick might sleep more or less, but they always did so under observation. Others watched closely. If breathing changed, if the face flushed, if sweat soaked, through the blankets, someone took notice. But unless death was near, there was little to be done in some communities. Night was also the time when quiet stories were told. Not every household had silence. Some parents whispered tales to children to distract them from hunger or cold. These were not long or fanciful. They were short, familiar, often tied to moral lessons. Stories of saints, of local legends, of odd creatures seen in the woods. But they were not read. Few could read. They were remembered, retold, passed down. Then, with eyes half closed and straw crackling under limbs, the room would quiet again. The story faded, breathing slowed. Sleep returned, candles burned low, fires died out, night took hold fully. Outside, the world remained still. No carriages, no streetlights, no noise. Just wind or the occasional night bird. In such a world, even shallow sleep had weight. It filled the hours until morning. It gave just enough restoration to keep going. And when the light returned again, the entire process began once more. The routine was always the same. As each day unfolded, it brought with it the same labor, the same rituals, the same fatigue. And when evening came again, people knew what was next, because it had always been that way. There was no guessing about what came after the work. The body, already used to the pattern, knew when to slow. The light would dim. The fire would shrink. And across the countryside, the people of the medieval world would begin to withdraw once more from the outer world and return to the cramped corners of rest, in homes made of wood and wattle, where wind slipped easily between the cracks. Families pulled close. Children were wrapped in wool or whatever fabric had survived the year's wear. Mothers adjusted cloaks over little shoulders. Fathers secured the latch on the door, not that it would truly keep anyone out, but because it was something to do before sleep. The last meal had already been eaten, the pot scraped clean, the spoon wiped and set aside. There were no leftovers. Food was never in excess. To be full was unusual. But even hunger faded behind tiredness. The kind of tiredness that came not from stress or thought, but from walking, lifting, standing, carrying, from doing things over and over again until the body surrendered. In some towns, people slept above their work. A cobbler lived over his shop. A baker had a loft built into the beams. The smells of the day lingered into the night. Leather, yeast, ash. A merchant's family might sleep behind a curtain that barely separated them from shelves of goods. Privacy didn't matter, not because people didn't want it, but because it wasn't an option. Walls were thin, rooms were shared, voices carried, even thoughts felt close to the air. Sleep came not from solitude, but from exhaustion and repetition. People knew their place. A laborer would lie near the door. A child would lie against the wall. If the family had a guest, that guest might sleep across the hearth, wrapped in his own coat. They didn't worry about making space. They simply accepted what there was. If there was a bench, someone would lie on it. If there was nothing but the floor, then that would have to do. The idea of comfort was different. It meant being dry, maybe being warm. Not softness. Not silence dot and manners and castles. Sleep was more ceremonial. The bed was large. Sometimes the biggest piece of furniture in the entire estate. Carved wood, heavy drapery, embroidered covers. But even here, the structure was greater than the comfort. Feather mattresses were heavy and lumpy. Linen sheets cooled quickly. Servants might warm the bedding with hot stones, but the heat disappeared fast. No matter how grand the bed looked, it was still a place to lie down and be still until morning. For nobles, the real luxury was the privacy. Separate chambers, separate air, and a quietness that the lower classes never experienced. Even then, they did not sleep entirely alone. A nobleman might have a servant sleeping in the outer chamber. A child might sleep nearby, or a scribe, or a guard. Total isolation was rare, and at night, sound still traveled. Wood creaked, wind hissed against the shutters. Someone somewhere would cough, and that sound would move through the walls like a whisper. The concept of a good night's sleep did not exist in the same way it does now. There was no expectation that rest would be peaceful. People woke often. They adjusted positions. They checked the fire. They stepped outside to relieve themselves. They returned. It was not unusual. It was simply part of the night. A farmer might wake and check his animals. A mother might nurse a baby, then lie back down without a word. These breaks in sleep were not considered disruptive. They were built into the rhythm of the night dot in monasteries. The break in sleep was more structured. Bells signaled the time to rise for prayers. A monk would climb from his simple bed, wrap himself in his robe, and walk silently with the others to the chapel. They chanted by candlelight, then returned to sleep if time allowed. This division of the night into two parts, with wakefulness. In the middle was common across medieval Europe. People didn't question it. It simply matched the flow of their lives. And in between these moments, between the work and the firelight, between the first sleep and the second, there was a kind of space. A pause that didn't require thought. It wasn't filled with noise. There were no stories to scroll, no tasks to finish. Just a stillness. The kind that can't really be described, only felt. In that stillness, people rested. Whether the sleep was deep or shallow didn't matter. What mattered was that time passed. The body stopped. The mind slowed. Most people did not dream vividly. Or if they did, they didn't remember. There was no reason to. Dreams didn't affect the next day's labor. They were not written down. They were not shared at breakfast. The events of the night, whether waking to a sound or dreaming of a field, all disappeared as soon as the first word called again. What remained was the ache in the back, the tightness in the shoulders, the sense that another night had ended and another day was about to begin. Children slept through almost anything, even when sharing space with snoring relatives or restless. Animals, they adjusted. A child who had known nothing else didn't expect silence. They learned to fall asleep to whispers, creaks, wind, rain, and if they cried, they were hushed quickly. Not from cruelty, but from practicality. Crying woke others, and others had to work dot as each night repeated this cycle. People developed their own routines, not in the modern sense of calming rituals or meditations, but in quiet habits. One might hang their boots in the same place. Another might place a tool within arm's reach in case it was needed before dawn. A mother might always lay her infant to sleep on her left side. A shepherd might check the latch twice before lying down. These small actions were their version of preparation. Then came stillness. Then came sleep. Outside, the night remained the same. Stars overhead, if the clouds allowed, the sound of an owl, a dog barking in the distance, the low hum of wind through trees or rooftops. The darkness itself had a texture like a heavy fabric laid over the world. In that dark, people disappeared into rest. And in the hours between one day and the next, everything paused, just long enough to begin again. When the stars had passed across the night sky and the edges of the eastern horizon began to fade into gray, the medieval world stirred again, not because it was time, but because it always had. There was no sunrise alarm, no formal announcement of the new day. It simply became lighter, and that was enough. Eyes opened, a body shifted, someone coughed. A boot scraped against a dirt floor. These were not moments of decision, but response. The light arrived, and so people responded. In the countryside, the day began with cold air pressing in around the sleeping forms. Blankets, if there were any, were still drawn close. But the cold always found its way in, through stone, through wood, through poorly sealed walls. And when the body felt that cold, it moved. Someone reached for the pot to check if the coals had survived the night. Another tried to rub warmth into their hands. A child rolled closer to a sibling or a parent. There was no rush, but there was no delay either. The work would not wait till morning, and a peasant's home was not marked by ceremony. There was no moment where everyone stood and greeted the day. It unfolded bit by bit from the edge of sleep to the edge of duty. The animals needed tending. The water needed fetching. A fire needed to be rekindled, not for comfort, but because nothing else could happen without it. Cold water could not cook grain. Frozen fingers could not weave or spin. And so, before anything else, someone dealt with the fire. Stirring embers, adding twigs, breathing gently until flame appeared. The food, if any remained, was the same as the day before, a crust of bread. A few spoonfuls of porridge, nothing elaborate, nothing warm unless the fire had been quick to catch. But hunger didn't wait. For food to be ready, people began their day with whatever was on hand. A few bites, a few sips, and then the movement started. Shoes, or what passed for them, were laced. Hair was pulled back. Scarves were wrapped. And slowly, each person turned to the work that belonged to them. In larger homes, the start of day was more structured, but no more luxurious. A nobleman might not rise at first light, but the house around him certainly did. Servants were expected to be moving long before the master opened his eyes. Fires were already burning in the kitchen. Water was warming in large pots. Cloaks were laid out, boots brushed. Everything had to appear effortless when the Lord or Lady woke, though, in truth, it had taken an hour or more of quiet movement to prepare it all. The servants themselves had little rest. They slept in small corners, sometimes near the kitchen or in the attic rooms. Their beds, if they had them, were narrow and shared. A single blanket between two people. They had fallen asleep later than everyone else and woke earlier, yet they did not complain. To have a position inside a manor was better than to be outside it. Even the worst servant was warmer and better fed than a field hand. In towns, the sun rising meant shops would soon open. But before the shutters lifted, before the signs were hung, there were preparations. A blacksmith reheated his forge. A weaver checked the tension of her loom. A cooper sorted wood. Apprentices arrived, often half asleep, wiping eyes and yawning. As they swept floors or fetched water, the town slowly came alive with footsteps and clinking tools. All of it happening quietly, steadily, as though the place had never really gone to sleep, only paused. No one measured these moments with a clock. The church bell rang at intervals, dividing the day into canonical hours, but for most people, Those were distant signals. Time was understood by light, sound, and habit. When the shadows stretched long, it was evening. When the crows called loudly from the field, it was near midday. When the air grew still and pink with fading sun, it was time to bring animals in, close windows, and prepare again for night. But before that happened, there was more work to be done. The middle of the day was not a time of rest. It was the peak of labor. Fields needed tending, clay needed shaping, wool needed spinning, children fetched and carried. Women cooked, washed, repaired. Men plowed, chopped, built. Everyone worked. Idleness was rare, and where it existed, it was often punished. In royal courts and noble houses, the labor was hidden, but no less present. A noble woman might spend hours managing the household, instructing servants, overseeing meals, or stitching fine garments by hand. A nobleman had meetings, records, letters, and land management. Comfort did not mean stillness. It meant choice and the ability to delegate. But even among Meili, the hours were full, and when the light began to fade again, the familiar preparations resumed. The small details that shape the transition from waking life back into night, the banking of the fire, the closing of shutters, the brushing of crumbs from tables, the final feeding of animals, the wrapping of infants. Voices grew quieter, movement slowed, and once more families returned to the place they had started the night before. The same bedding, the same straw, the same heavy blankets. And they lay down not because they were ready to sleep, but because there was nothing left to do. Was the rhythm of the medieval world a pattern of effort and exhaustion, of light and dark, of hunger and hope? Every day followed the same structure because it had to. Because deviation meant risk. Because to live any other way would invite danger. And so the people lay down again, with muscles sore, eyes heavy, and minds already forgetting the day. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, a soft howl against the side of a barn. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The fire in the hearth crackled low. A child turned in sleep. A woman sighed. The village returned to stillness. The night returned, exactly as it had the night before. As most people in the medieval world lay still beneath rough blankets, their bones sore from a day's labor, their sleep light and easily broken by the smallest sound. A different kind of night unfolded far away amid upper reaches of stone. Castles, behind thick doors and heavy tapestries, in chambers warmed by large hearths, kings and noble lords prepared for rest in ways that few common people would ever witness. Their nights did not begin with the closing of shutters or the sweeping of floors. They began with quiet ceremony. A servant unlatched a jeweled cloak. Another lifted off a pair of velvet-lined boots. A basin of water was brought for washing, warm, often scented with herbs or rose water. Soft towels were held open. Words were not needed. Each attendant knew his task. The real bed was the most extravagant piece of furniture in the entire castle. It was carved from oak or walnut, dark and heavy, often towering several feet above the ground. A small stool helped the king climb into it. The mattress was filled not with straw, but with down or fine wool, layered with thick quilts and embroidered sheets. Curtains could be drawn around the entire bed, trapping in warmth and blocking out drafts. At the head of the bed, sometimes, a tapestry hung, not for decoration alone, but to display the family's crest, a quiet reminder of power. In these chambers, the sounds of the outer world were muffled. The shouting from courtyards, the clatter of armor, the voice of a stable boy, all of it faded behind the stone and fabric. Instead, the king heard only the low popping of the fire or the hush of whispered conversations between his closest servants. His thoughts were not on whether the roof would leak or if the pigs had been fed. Those concerns were far below him, handled by men who barely slept at all. Even with such luxury, the structure of sleep was familiar. The king, too, would rise early, though not as early as his guards. His sleep might be interrupted by news from a messenger or by the moans of an aching body aged by battle or illness. Yet his discomforts were treated with ointments, oils, and the best medical knowledge of the time. Physicians, if needed, could be called from their chambers. Herbal infusions were prepared, and when morning came, breakfast was not a crust of hard bread, but a warm plate of soft eggs, roasted meats, stewed fruit, and spiced wine. This contrast between the royal chambers and the cold, cramped huts of peasants was not seen as unfair. It was seen as natural. Each person had their place. The king ruled by divine right. The farmer tilled soil. The blacksmith shaped iron. The priest guided souls. The beggar wandered, and the noble feasted. That was the world. The servants in the castle did not expect to sleep on feather beds. They were grateful to be near warmth at all. To see the luxury was enough. To serve inside it, close enough to feel the heat from the hearth, was already considered a privilege. A king's sleep might be protected by soldiers. At night, guards walked the halls, listening for intruders. A knight stood watch near the door. Outside the castle walls, patrols moved along the battlements. Torches flickered in iron brackets. The castle never fully slept. Yet inside, wrapped in furs and linen, the king rested deeply, not just from comfort, but from knowing that dozens of others remained awake to ensure his rest could continue. Royal children slept in chambers nearby. They too were wrapped in warmth, with maids to monitor their dreams and pages to fetch water if they woke. Their education and etiquette began in these rooms. They were taught not only how to govern, but how to rise gracefully, how to dress in layers, how to sleep with dignity. Every detail mattered. Even dreams were considered important, especially those thought to be sent by God or seen as omens. But power did not always mean peace. A nobleman might toss in his bed, worrying about threats from rivals or complaints from advisors. A king might lie awake, wondering if his army was large enough or if his enemies plotted in the dark. Still, these thoughts occurred in comfort, the kind of comfort the lower classes could not imagine. No straw poked through linen, no mice crept under bedding, no smoke filled the room. The luxury softened every fear, even if it could not erase it. And while the king slept in silence, beyond the castle gates, the villages were quiet again. The fire in the peasant's hearth had died. The coals turned to ash. The straw pallets, slightly flattened from use, still cradled the bodies of children and elders, all huddled together beneath the same wool cloth. Their dreams were simpler. They did not see maps or crowns. They dreamed of full baskets, of rain at the right time, of chickens that laid more eggs. Their sleep was not luxurious, but it was necessary. It gave them the strength to carry another day, to endure another task, to bend their backs again in service to a world that rarely thanked them. Between these two worlds, the peasant's bed and the king's, lay all of medieval life. It was a world built on distance and class. The sun rose for both, but it warmed them differently. The wind blew for both, but some had stone walls, and others had none. And when the day ended, both lay down, not as equals, but as parts of a whole, each shaped by centuries of order, duty, and belief. And so, as the final night of this journey deepens and the world falls quiet once more, we return to that same rhythm: work, rest, silence, sleep. A rhythm that carried the medieval world through centuries of darkness and dawn, through comfort and hardship, through forgotten lives and remembered names. It was never fair. It was never equal, but it was lived fully, completely, night after night. And now, as your own eyes grow heavy and the quiet world of long ago settles into the shadows. We close the story for tonight. The fire is low, the stars are high, the king has slept, the farmer has turned, and the village is still once again